Japan stands as an archipelago of nearly 7,000 islands scattered across the western Pacific Ocean. This geographic isolation fostered a unique civilization, one that developed in relative seclusion, yet was periodically transformed by carefully filtered influences from the Asian mainland. This distinctive environment gave birth to the samurai tradition and the feudal system that defined Japan for nearly 1,000 years. The Japanese landscape features volcanic mountains covering 80% of the land, creating natural barriers between regions and fostering distinct local identities. Dense forests clothe steep slopes, giving way to narrow coastal plains, where rice paddies create a patchwork of brilliant green. Swift-flowing rivers cut through valleys, while the surrounding seas both protect and connect the island nation to the wider world. In this dramatic setting, a society evolved unlike any other. The word samurai itself comes from the Japanese verb saburao, meaning to serve. Service to one's lord, to one's family, and to a demanding code of honor defined the samurai existence. These warriors were far more than mere servants. They served as administrators, artists, philosophers, and the architects of a complex social order that would endure for centuries. The story of feudal Japan spans over 2,000 years, from ancient origins to the final samurai rebellions of the 19th century. It encompasses tales of honor and betrayal, of dazzling cultural achievements amid devastating warfare, of rigid social hierarchies and surprising social mobility. A warrior elite created a distinctive culture and value system that continues to fascinate the world long after their swords have been laid to rest. The historical tapestry includes the sound of temple bells echoing through mountain valleys, the rustling of silk robes in imperial courts, the rhythmic clacking of wooden sandals on stone pathways, and the battle cries of armored warriors on blood-soaked fields. The serenity of Zen meditation halls contrasted with the tension of castle keeps, where lords plotted their next conquests. The delicate brushstrokes of master calligraphers occupied the same society as the deadly precision of master swordsmen. For in the world of the samurai, the arts of peace and war were often practiced with equal devotion. The first settlers of the Japanese archipelago arrived over land bridges during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and Japan was connected to the Asian mainland. These early inhabitants developed a sophisticated hunting and gathering culture known as jomon, creating some of the world's earliest pottery and living in harmony with the abundant forests and seas. Their spiritual practices, centered on reverence for nature spirits, laid the foundation for Japan's indigenous Shinto religion and influenced Japanese sensibilities for millennia to come. The historical narrative of Japan reveals how a warrior class elevated honor to an art form and transformed warfare into a spiritual path. From the very beginnings of Japanese history, the foundations were being laid for the remarkable society that would one day give rise to the legendary samurai warrior. These spiritual practices of the earliest Japanese inhabitants would evolve gradually over millennia, becoming intertwined with the later development of samurai culture. The Jomon period, lasting from approximately 14,500 to 900 before the Common Era, established the foundation of Japanese spiritual life with its animistic beliefs and reverence for natural forces. Elaborate clay figurines called doge suggest sophisticated ritual practices, while distinctive cord-marked pottery reveals both artistic sensibility and practical ingenuity. These early inhabitants lived in semi-subterranean pit dwellings arranged in small villages, sustaining themselves through hunting, fishing, and gathering the abundant resources of the Japanese forests. A profound cultural transformation began around 900 BCE with the arrival of new migrations from the Asian mainland, marking the beginning of the Yayoi period. These newcomers brought wet rice agriculture, weaving, and metalworking technologies that revolutionized life in the archipelago. Bronze weapons and tools appeared alongside iron implements, dramatically increasing agricultural productivity and changing settlement patterns. The labor-intensive practice of rice cultivation required cooperative effort and complex irrigation systems, fostering more hierarchical social structures and the emergence of powerful clan leaders. This period saw the gradual formation of distinct political entities across the Japanese islands. Chinese chronicles from the 3rd century describe a land called Wa, composed of more than 100 small states. The most notable account mentions a powerful female ruler named Himiko, who controlled a federation of these states from her capital in Yamato. She was described as a shamaness who used divination to govern her people, suggesting the powerful connection between political leadership and spiritual authority in early Japan. By the 4th century, archaeological evidence shows increasing social stratification. Enormous burial mounds called kofun began to appear across the landscape, some spanning hundreds of meters in length. These keyhole-shaped earthen structures, surrounded by moats and often containing elaborate burial goods, signified the emergence of powerful ruling elites who commanded substantial resources and labor. Horse trappings, weapons, and ceremonial objects found in these tombs indicate the growing importance of military prowess among these early Japanese leaders, the distant precursors to the later samurai class. The material culture of this Kofun period, from 250 to 538, reveals intensive interaction with the Korean peninsula and China. Bronze mirrors, iron weapons, and gold ornaments show stylistic influences from the mainland and suggest diplomatic connections. These foreign contacts would prove crucial for Japan's development, bringing not only material goods, but also writing systems, philosophical concepts, and religious traditions that would profoundly shape Japanese civilization. Writing first came to Japan through Chinese characters, initially used to write the Chinese language, but gradually adapted to represent Japanese sounds and words. This complex process of linguistic borrowing and adaptation reflected the broader pattern by which Japan selectively absorbed foreign influences while transforming them into something distinctly Japanese. The absence of writing in prehistoric Japan means much of its early history remains shrouded in legend and myth, preserved in oral traditions later recorded in chronicles compiled during the 8th century. These early chronicles, the Kojiki, record of ancient matters, completed in 712, and Nihon Shoki, chronicles of Japan, finished in 720, present an origin story blending history with mythology. They describe the creation of the Japanese islands by divine beings, the descent of the imperial lineage from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the activities of the early emperors. While clearly serving the political purpose of legitimizing imperial rule, these texts also preserve valuable information about early Japanese society, beliefs, and customs. Agriculture, particularly rice cultivation, formed the economic foundation of early Japan. Rice was not merely a staple food, but also served as a form of wealth, a medium of exchange, and a sacred offering. The agricultural calendar structured daily life, with seasonal festivals marking key points in the farming cycle. This close relationship with the land and its cycles instilled a profound awareness of impermanence and seasonal change that would later find expression in distinctive Japanese aesthetic sensibilities that would deeply influence samurai arts and culture. Trade networks gradually expanded both within the Japanese islands and beyond. Maritime connections linked coastal communities, allowing for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Obsidian, pottery, salt, and seafood moved along these routes, creating economic interdependencies between regions. Archaeological excavations have revealed Chinese coins, Korean pottery, and other continental goods at sites throughout the Japanese archipelago, testifying to the importance of foreign trade despite Japan's geographic isolation. The mountainous terrain of Japan created natural barriers between regions, fostering the development of distinct local cultures and political entities. This geographic fragmentation would later contribute to the decentralized power structure of feudal Japan, with regional lords maintaining considerable autonomy. The combination of mountain barriers and surrounding seas meant that Japan could selectively control its engagement with the outside world, a pattern that would become particularly significant during the later period of samurai rule, when the country deliberately limited foreign contact. In this formative period of Japanese history, the seeds of later cultural developments were already present. A blend of indigenous traditions with selective foreign borrowings, a hierarchical social structure, reverence for ancestors and nature, agricultural wealth as the foundation of power, and the growing importance of military strength. The stage was being set for the emergence of a centralized state that would eventually give rise to the distinctive warrior aristocracy known as the samurai. As regional powers coalesced in early Japan, one clan gradually emerged as supreme. The Yamato clan established dominance in central Japan during the 4th and 5th centuries, creating Japan's first recognizable state structure. This powerful lineage claimed divine descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, establishing a sacred connection that would legitimize their rule for centuries to come. The Yamato rulers united various clans through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and religious authority. Their emergence marked the true beginning of the Japanese imperial line, the world's oldest continuous monarchy that continues unbroken to the present day. The early Yamato rulers consolidated their position through an ingenious system of alliances with powerful regional clan leaders. These local magnates, known as uji, maintained considerable autonomy in their territories while acknowledging the supremacy of the Yamato court. Each uji controlled specific hereditary occupations and religious functions, creating a complex web of interdependence centered on the imperial family. The emperor served as the symbolic head of this confederation, performing crucial religious rituals that were believed to ensure the prosperity and harmony of the realm. A pivotal moment in Japanese history arrived in 538, when Buddhism was officially introduced to Japan via the Korean kingdom of Baekje. A diplomatic mission presented the Yamato court with Buddhist scriptures, a statue of the Buddha, and other ritual objects. This foreign faith arrived alongside advanced technologies, Chinese writing, and continental political ideas. The acceptance of Buddhism sparked internal conflict among the conservative clans who favored maintaining indigenous Shinto practices and those who saw advantages in adopting elements of continental civilization. After initial resistance, Buddhism gained imperial support and began to transform Japanese culture. Prince Shotoku, who served as regent from 594 to 622, became the great champion of Buddhist learning and Chinese-style governance. He authorized the construction of Japan's first great Buddhist temples, sent diplomatic missions and students to China, and issued Japan's earliest formal legal code, the 17-article Constitution. This document emphasized Confucian principles of harmony, respect for authority, and ethical government service. Though less a constitution in the modern sense than a set of moral precepts for officials, it represented an important step toward a more centralized state administration. The most dramatic transformation of the early Japanese state came with the Taika reform of 645, launched following a court coup. The victorious faction implemented a series of sweeping changes modeled after the Chinese Tang dynasty system. These reforms introduced a centralized bureaucracy, a complex legal code, and a land redistribution system. The new order theoretically abolished private land ownership, declared all land the property of the emperor, and established a system where agricultural fields would be reallocated every 6 years based on household size. A comprehensive administrative system divided the country into provinces, districts, and villages, each with appointed officials responsible for tax collection, conscription, and maintaining order. The reforms also established the Ritsuryo system, a detailed legal code covering both criminal matters and administrative procedures. This system created ranks and offices within a complex bureaucracy, specifying the responsibilities, privileges, and ceremonial roles of each position. To implement this ambitious political vision, the Japanese established their first permanent capital city at Heijokyo, modern Nara, in 710. Modeled after the Chinese capital Chang'an, this planned city featured a grand ceremonial avenue, a carefully laid grid pattern of streets, and impressive government buildings. Buddhist temples of unprecedented scale rose throughout the capital, housing treasures of religious art and serving as centers of learning. The most spectacular of these, Todaiji, contained a massive bronze Buddha statue over 15 meters tall, symbolizing the growing wealth and sophistication of the Japanese state. Despite these ambitious reforms, the reality of Japanese political life often diverged from the ideal Chinese-inspired model. Geographic barriers and limited transportation technology made centralized control difficult to maintain, especially in distant provinces. Powerful aristocratic families continued to dominate both the court and their local regions, gradually turning court offices into hereditary possessions. The land redistribution system proved impractical to implement and gradually fell into disuse, allowing large private estates to re-emerge under different legal frameworks. During this formative period, a distinctive synthesis began to emerge between imported continental traditions and indigenous Japanese practices. Rather than replacing native Shinto beliefs, Buddhism formed a syncretic relationship with them. Shinto kami, the indigenous nature and ancestral spirits, came to be viewed as local manifestations or protectors of Buddhist deities. This non-exclusive religious sensibility allowed Japanese culture to absorb foreign elements while maintaining continuity with ancient traditions. The cultural flowering of this period is exemplified by the Manyoshu, the collection of 10,000 leaves, Japan's first great anthology of poetry, compiled during the 8th century. Its verses, composed by emperors, court nobles, and even frontier guards, capture the emotional and spiritual life of early Japan. These poems reveal a profound sensitivity to nature, the changing seasons and human emotions, aesthetic sensibilities that would later become central to samurai culture. This era also saw important developments in architecture, sculpture, painting, and calligraphy, as Japanese artisans mastered continental techniques while gradually developing distinctive styles. Music and dance for court rituals evolved into refined performing arts. Literary Chinese became the standard written language for government documents and scholarly works, though a modified system using Chinese characters phonetically to write Japanese was also emerging. The political transformation of early Japan laid crucial groundwork for later feudal institutions. The Ritsuryo system established ranks, offices, and ceremonial roles that would influence Japanese political culture for centuries. The practice of appointing provincial governors and local officials prefigured the later system of daimyo lords and their samurai retainers. Most importantly, this period established enduring patterns of centralized authority, coexisting with considerable regional autonomy, a tension that would characterize Japanese feudalism throughout its history. While true samurai had not yet emerged during this formative period, professional warriors were beginning to gain importance, especially along frontier regions where conflicts with indigenous peoples required military expertise. These early warriors served primarily as guards and police forces, rather than as a distinct social class. Yet their growing role in maintaining order and protecting territorial boundaries foreshadowed the later rise of the samurai as Japan's dominant military and political elite. The imperial court sought greater independence from Buddhist institutional power that had grown influential during the Nara period. In 794, Emperor Kanmu moved the capital to a new city called Heian Kyo, modern-day Kyoto, marking the beginning of the Heian period. This new capital would serve as Japan's imperial center for over 1,000 years, until 1868. The city was designed according to Chinese geomantic principles, with a grand central avenue flanked by a grid of streets. The imperial palace occupied the northern section, while aristocratic mansions spread southward, and Buddhist temples were strategically positioned to protect the city from malevolent spiritual influences. At the apex of Heian society stood the imperial family, surrounded by a small circle of court nobles who monopolized the highest government positions. These aristocrats, numbering perhaps a few thousand individuals, developed an extraordinarily refined culture centered on aesthetic sensibility, literary accomplishment, and elaborate court ceremonies. Their world revolved around the imperial court, where subtle nuances of rank, costume, and etiquette signaled one's position in the rigid social hierarchy. For these elites, beauty and artistic accomplishment became central values, with poetry composition, calligraphy, music, and the appreciation of nature considered essential aristocratic skills. The most influential noble family of this era was the Fujiwara clan, who dominated court politics through a clever strategy of marrying their daughters to successive emperors. By positioning themselves as maternal relatives and regents to young emperors, the Fujiwara effectively controlled imperial authority while maintaining the fiction of direct imperial rule. The height of Fujiwara power came under Fujiwara no Michinaga in the early 11th century, who served as regent for 4 emperors and grandfather to 3 more. His diary famously recorded his satisfaction. "This world, I think, is indeed my world." Aristocratic women of the Heian period enjoyed unusual freedom and cultural influence compared to later eras. Many received extensive education in literature, poetry, and music. Some managed their own property and engaged in political matters through their male relatives. Most significantly, women produced much of the greatest literature of the age, writing in the vernacular Japanese language rather than the formal Chinese used for official documents and male scholarly writing. This literary flowering included poetry collections, personal diaries, and perhaps most famously, Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji, often considered the world's first novel and a masterpiece of psychological insight. The aesthetic sensibilities developed during the Heian period would profoundly influence all subsequent Japanese culture, including the later samurai class. Court nobles cultivated a heightened appreciation for the subtle, the transient, and the suggestive. The concept of mono no aware, a poignant awareness of the impermanence of all things, permeated artistic expression. The changing seasons, falling cherry blossoms, autumn leaves, and other natural phenomena became potent symbols of the beautiful yet fleeting nature of life itself. This aesthetic sensibility found expression in poetry, painting, garden design, and even the arrangement of incense or the folding of garments. While the court aristocracy developed their refined aesthetic culture, significant changes were occurring in the provinces that would ultimately transform Japanese society. The Ritsuryo system of public land and tax collection gradually broke down as nobles, temples, and shrines accumulated tax-exempt estates called shuin. These private properties, often managed by local notable families, increasingly escaped central government control. Absentee aristocratic proprietors in the capital relied on local managers to maintain order and collect revenues, creating opportunities for provincial elites to build their own power bases. The imperial court, focused on ceremonial functions and cultural refinement, gradually lost effective control over the countryside. Provincial governorships, once rotated among court nobles, became increasingly hereditary and autonomous. Tax revenue flowing to the central government diminished, while regional power centers multiplied. The court responded by appointing powerful warriors as provincial governors, expecting them to restore order and ensure tax collection. But these military men often established their own independent authority instead. The need for security in the provinces led to the emergence of local military bands centered around influential families. The term samurai, meaning one who serves, first appeared during this period to describe these armed retainers who provided protection for shuin estates and their managers. Initially low in status and often employed by noble proprietors or provincial officials, these early warriors gradually developed their own distinctive values, practices, and family networks. They emphasized martial skills, personal loyalty, and practical administration, rather than the refined aesthetic culture of the court. Two great warrior clans rose to particular prominence during the late Heian period: the Taira and the Minamoto. Both claimed distant imperial descent and had served the court as military leaders for generations. The Taira, led by Taira no Kiyomori, gained unprecedented influence at court in the late 12th century, following their successful suppression of rivals in the Hogan and Heiji rebellions. Kiyomori became the first warrior to attain the highest court offices, traditionally reserved for the Fujiwara and other established noble families. He married his daughter to the emperor, and his grandson became Emperor Antoku, representing the peak of Taira power and the increasing militarization of Japanese politics. The extravagance and arrogance of Taira rule, however, created many enemies. Provincial warrior families resented their monopolization of power, while traditional court nobles bristled at their upstart status and military methods. The Minamoto clan, temporarily eclipsed after earlier defeats, rebuilt their power in eastern Japan under the leadership of Minamoto no Yoritomo. The stage was set for a decisive conflict that would transform Japan's political structure and establish samurai dominance for the next 7 centuries. The gap between the elegant world of the Heian court and the harsh reality of provincial life grew ever wider. Court nobles composed poetry about cherry blossoms, while provincial warriors engaged in bloody power struggles. Yet aspects of court culture gradually filtered down to these emerging warrior elites, who increasingly adopted aristocratic aesthetic values alongside their martial ethos. This distinctive blend of martial prowess with artistic refinement would become a hallmark of mature samurai culture in subsequent centuries. The Heian period, for all its cultural brilliance, contained the seeds of its own transformation. The very aesthetic that celebrated impermanence and the poignant beauty of decline seemed to anticipate the court's eventual loss of practical power. As the 12th century progressed, provincial warriors increasingly asserted themselves in national politics, challenging the courtiers' monopoly on legitimate authority. The elegant world immortalized in The Tale of Genji was about to give way to a new order dominated by the samurai class, whose values, priorities, and institutions would define Japan's distinctive form of feudalism. The simmering tensions between the Taira and Minamoto clans erupted into open warfare in 1180, beginning the 5-year conflict known as the Genpei War. This pivotal struggle would definitively establish samurai dominance in Japanese politics and mark the true beginning of feudal Japan. The war began when Prince Mochihito, a son of the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, who had been passed over for succession, issued a call to arms against the Taira. Though the prince was quickly captured and killed, his appeal resonated with discontented warriors throughout the provinces, particularly among the Minamoto and their allies. Minamoto no Yoritomo, then in exile in the eastern province of Izu, seized this opportunity to rebuild his clan's fortunes. Though initially hesitant, Yoritomo raised his banner of rebellion and quickly attracted support from warrior families throughout eastern Japan. He established his headquarters at Kamakura, a naturally defensible location near modern Tokyo, from which he would direct operations while building a new administrative structure for his growing network of samurai allies. The early phase of the war favored the Taira, who controlled the imperial capital and its resources. The Minamoto forces suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Ishibashiyama, Yoritomo's first military engagement. His younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, achieved greater success in central Japan, eventually capturing Kyoto in 1883 and forcing the Taira to flee the capital with the young emperor Antoku. However, Yoshinaka's unruly behavior in the capital alienated the court nobility and prompted Yoritomo to send his younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to bring him under control. Yoshinaka was defeated and killed by Yoshitsune's forces in 1184. Yoshitsune, a brilliant military tactician, then pursued the retreating Taira forces. The decisive naval battle of Dan-no-Ura took place in 1185 in the Shimonoseki Strait. The Minamoto fleet destroyed Taira naval power, and many Taira warriors, including the child Emperor Antoku, drowned in the sea rather than face capture. The defeat effectively ended Taira power, with survivors forced to flee to remote provinces or face execution. The battle became legendary in Japanese culture, immortalized in epic tales and no-dramas that portrayed the ghostly spirits of drowned Taira warriors. The Genpei War transformed Japanese warfare. The conflict featured large-scale battles involving thousands of mounted samurai, naval engagements with hundreds of ships, and siege operations against fortified positions. Warriors fought both as individual champions in ritualized single combat and as disciplined units following complex tactical plans. The samurai of this era typically fought as mounted archers, with the bow considered the primary weapon of the elite warrior. The famous curved sword, later symbolically central to samurai identity, was initially a secondary weapon used when arrows were exhausted or in close quarters. Tales of warrior heroism during the Genpei War helped establish the ideal of samurai conduct. Minamoto no Yoshitsune became the archetype of the brilliant, tragic hero, a superb warrior betrayed by political circumstances. The loyal Benkei, a giant warrior monk who followed Yoshitsune to death, exemplified the virtue of absolute loyalty. Even defeated enemies like Taira no Tomomori, who tied himself to an anchor before plunging into the sea at Dan-no-Ura, demonstrated the warrior's preference for death over surrender that would become a samurai ideal. Victory in the Genpei War allowed Minamoto no Yoritomo to consolidate power in an unprecedented way. Rather than following the traditional pattern of placing a puppet emperor on the throne while controlling affairs from behind the scenes, Yoritomo established a separate governmental structure based in Kamakura, far from the imperial court in Kyoto. In 1292, he received from the emperor the title of Sei Taishogun, or Shogun, great general who subdues the barbarians, which had previously been a temporary military commission, but now became the basis for a hereditary military government. Yoritomo's government, called the Bakufu, or tent government, established the pattern for feudal rule that would endure through various forms until 1868. The shogun ruled as the emperor's military deputy, but exercised actual political power. Yoritomo placed his trusted retainers in key provincial positions as constables and stewards, creating a network of samurai administrators loyal to him personally rather than to the imperial court. This dual structure of authority, imperial court and shogunal government, would characterize Japanese politics for the next 7 centuries. The basis of this new feudal order was the personal bond between lord and vassal. Warriors swore loyalty to Yoritomo and received in return official confirmation of their land rights and administrative authority. This relationship, formalized in written oaths, created a hierarchical chain of obligation and protection that defined the emerging samurai class. While influenced by earlier Japanese patron-client relationships, this feudal bond also resembled the lord-vassal relationships developing contemporaneously in medieval Europe, though with distinctive Japanese characteristics. The triumph of the Minamoto and the establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate marked the definitive ascendancy of the samurai class. The court nobility in Kyoto retained their ceremonial prestige and cultural authority, but exercised decreasing political influence. Real power now resided with those who commanded the loyalty of warriors. The ability to reward followers with land, titles, and administrative positions became the foundation of political authority, creating a new social order with the samurai at its apex. The values associated with the samurai likewise achieved cultural dominance. Martial prowess, unflinching loyalty, austerity, and practical administrative skill were increasingly celebrated in contrast to the refined aesthetic sensibilities of the court. Yet the relationship between warrior and courtly cultures proved complex. Even as samurai gained political supremacy, they selectively adopted elements of aristocratic culture, including poetry, calligraphy, and religious practices. This synthesis of martial and aesthetic values would become a hallmark of mature samurai culture. The Genpei War and its aftermath transformed not just Japan's political structure, but its cultural imagination. The conflict inspired Japan's greatest war tale, the Heike Monogatari, which recounted the rise and fall of the Taira clan. Initially transmitted orally by blind minstrels who accompanied themselves on biwa lutes, the tale combined historical accounts with Buddhist themes of impermanence and karmic retribution. Its famous opening lines, "The sound of the bell of Gion Temple echoes the impermanence of all things," captured the Buddhist sense that worldly glory, like the once mighty Taira clan, inevitably fades away. Yoritomo died in 1199 after a fall from his horse, and his direct line ended when his sons were assassinated, allowing power to pass to the Hojo clan, relatives by marriage who would rule as regents for figurehead shoguns. Yet the system Yoritomo created would endure, establishing the institutional framework and cultural foundations of feudal Japan that would continue to evolve through centuries of samurai rule. With the establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate, Japan entered a new historical phase defined by samurai governance. The Bakufu, originally conceived as Yoritomo's personal headquarters, evolved into a complex governmental institution with administrative bureaus, judicial courts, and deliberative councils. The heart of this system was the samurai dokoro, or board of retainers, which managed relations with vassals, recorded land holdings, and settled disputes among warriors. This organization exemplified the practical, administrative focus of samurai rule, in contrast to the ritual-centered governance of the imperial court. Following Yoritomo's death in 1199, actual power passed to the Hojo clan. Yoritomo's young sons, Yori-ije and Sanetomo, successively held the title of shogun, but both died under suspicious circumstances. Yori possibly assassinated by Hojo agents, and Sanetomo murdered by his own nephew at the Tsurugaoka Hachiman shrine in Kamakura. After Sanetomo's death in 1219, the Hojo family instituted a regency system, installing imperial princes or members of the Fujiwara family as titular shoguns, while wielding real authority themselves through the position of shikan or regent. This complex structure of delegated authority, the emperor delegating to the shogun, who was in turn controlled by the Hojo regent, reflected a distinctively Japanese approach to political legitimacy. Direct power was veiled behind layers of ceremonial authority, creating a separation between symbolic legitimacy and actual governance. This political philosophy would persist throughout the feudal period, even as different warrior houses rose and fell in the struggle for dominance. The Kamakura Bakufu governed through a network of vassals who had sworn personal loyalty to Yoritomo. These gokenin, or housemen, received official recognition of their land holdings and administrative authority in exchange for military service when called upon. The shogunate appointed jito, or stewards, to manage and collect revenues from estates, and shugo, or constables, to maintain order and lead military forces in each province. This system allowed centralized control while accommodating the realities of limited communication and transportation technology in medieval Japan. A distinctive feature of the Kamakura Shogunate was its judicial system. The Bakufu established regular courts to hear disputes among its vassals, developing a body of precedent-based law focused on practical resolution rather than abstract principles. Samurai valued clear, decisive judgments that maintained order and respected established rights. Land disputes, inheritance conflicts, and questions of vassalage obligations constituted the majority of cases. This emphasis on practical jurisprudence reflected the samurai ethos of direct action and administrative effectiveness. During this period, the emerging samurai class developed distinctive cultural values and spiritual practices that would define their identity for centuries. The ideal of Bushido, the way of the warrior, began to take shape as a code of conduct emphasizing loyalty, honor, martial skill, and self-discipline. Drawing from Buddhist, Confucian, and indigenous traditions, Bushido promoted stoic endurance, emotional restraint, and preferring death to dishonor. While the term Bushido itself would not become common until the 17th century, its core values were clearly evident in Kamakura period texts and behavior. Zen Buddhism gained particular influence among the samurai during the Kamakura period. Introduced from China, Zen emphasized meditation, direct insight, and the transcendence of conceptual thinking. Its austere discipline, emphasis on direct experience, and rejection of elaborate ritual appealed to warrior sensibilities. Zen monks often served as advisors to shogunate officials, and Zen monasteries became centers for the transmission of continental culture, including literature, painting, architecture, and garden design. The Zen aesthetic of simplicity and understatement would become a defining feature of samurai cultural expression. Other new Buddhist movements also flourished in this era, reflecting a spiritual awakening among all classes of Japanese society. Pure Land Buddhism, propagated by the monk Honen and his disciple Shinran, offered salvation through faith in Amida Buddha, appealing particularly to commoners with its accessible practices. Nichiren developed a nationalistic form of Buddhism centered on the Lotus Sutra, prophesying that Japan would become the center for Buddhist renewal. These new sects, with their emphasis on personal faith and simplified practices, challenged the esoteric ritual Buddhism of the court aristocracy and offered spiritual paths more suited to the practical warrior class and ordinary people. The military skills that defined the samurai continued to evolve during the Kamakura period. Mounted archery remained the prestigious combat form for elite warriors, requiring years of training to master. Samurai armor became increasingly sophisticated, with lamellae of lacquered leather or metal laced together with silk cords to create flexible protection. The curved sword gained greater prominence, with bladesmiths developing innovative forging techniques that produced weapons of legendary sharpness and resilience. Military training emphasized not only technical skill, but spiritual preparation, with warriors cultivating the mental discipline to face death unflinchingly. The Kamakura Shogunate faced its greatest challenge in the Mongol invasion attempts of 1274 and 1281. Under Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire dispatched massive fleets and armies to conquer Japan. The first invasion landed on Kyushu, but withdrew after a severe storm damaged their fleet. The second invasion, far larger, consisted of 2 fleets with combined forces, numbering perhaps 140,000 warriors. After fierce fighting on the beaches of Kyushu, another massive typhoon destroyed much of the Mongol fleet, forcing the survivors to withdraw. These fortuitous storms, credited to divine intervention, became known as kamikaze, or divine winds. The Mongol invasions strained the Kamakura Bakufu, despite their ultimate failure. Unlike previous conflicts against Japanese opponents, these foreign invasions offered no opportunity for land rewards to loyal vassals, as no Mongol territories could be distributed in Japan. Many samurai families faced financial hardship after mobilizing for war without receiving compensatory rewards. The invasions also accelerated changes in warfare, as the Mongols introduced tactics and weapons unfamiliar to the Japanese, including coordinated cavalry formations, explosive bombs, and siege engines that challenged traditional samurai combat methods centered on individual prowess. Economic and social changes during the Kamakura period gradually undermined the original basis of samurai authority. The practice of dividing inherited lands among multiple sons led to the fragmentation of samurai estates and increasing economic pressure on warrior families. Many samurai became indebted to moneylenders, particularly wealthy merchants and religious institutions. The Jito position, originally a temporary administrative appointment, increasingly became hereditary, with stewards claiming ownership rights over the lands they managed. These changes created tensions within the warrior class and between samurai and cultivators of the land. The artistic and literary culture of the Kamakura period reflected the increased influence of samurai values and aesthetics. War tales like the Heike Monogatari became a major literary genre, celebrating martial virtue while often incorporating Buddhist themes of impermanence and karmic consequence. Traditional court arts continued, but adopted more austere, disciplined forms, appealing to samurai patrons. This period saw the development of distinctively Japanese forms in architecture, garden design, and ceramic arts, often influenced by Zen aesthetics of simplicity, asymmetry, and suggestion rather than explicit statement. As the Kamakura period progressed, strains appeared in the relationship between the imperial court and the shogunate. Emperor Go-Daigo, ascending the throne in 1318, resented the limitations on imperial power and secretly planned to restore direct imperial rule. His conspiracies were initially discovered and suppressed by the Kamakura Bakufu, which sent him into exile. However, Go-Daigo escaped, raised a new rebellion, and found support among discontented warriors, including Ashikaga Takauji, a Bakufu commander who defected to the imperial cause. In 1333, Takauji captured Kyoto, while another imperial supporter, Nitta Yoshisada, led an attack on Kamakura itself, destroying the shogunate's seat of power. After nearly 150 years, the Kamakura Shogunate collapsed, ending Japan's first sustained experiment in samurai governance, but setting patterns that would influence all subsequent forms of feudal rule in Japan. The fall of the Kamakura Shogunate in 1333 opened a new chapter in the evolution of samurai rule. Emperor Go-Daigo, having successfully overthrown the Bakufu with the help of disaffected warriors, attempted to restore direct imperial governance through the Kenmu Restoration. This brief experiment in imperial rule quickly faltered as Go-Daigo rewarded court nobles rather than the samurai who had fought for his cause. Ashikaga Takauji, the powerful warrior who had initially supported Go-Daigo, grew disillusioned with the emperor's governance and raised his banner in rebellion. By 1336, Takauji had seized Kyoto and installed a rival emperor from a different branch of the imperial family. Go-Daigo fled to the mountainous Yoshino region south of the capital, establishing a competing imperial court. This began the period of the northern and southern courts, with two rival imperial lines, each claiming legitimacy. The northern court in Kyoto, supported by the Ashikaga, controlled the traditional seat of power, while the southern court in Yoshino maintained a stronger claim to imperial succession. This schism would last for nearly 60 years, creating a complex landscape of competing loyalties and legitimacy claims. Takauji established a new military government, modeled on the Kamakura Bakufu, but centered in Kyoto rather than distant Kamakura. He received the title of shogun in 1338, founding the Ashikaga Shogunate that would rule Japan for over 2 centuries. Unlike the Kamakura Shogunate, which governed from a distance while leaving the imperial court intact in Kyoto, the Ashikaga established their headquarters in the Muromachi district of Kyoto, giving the period its name. This physical proximity to the imperial court created a distinctive blend of aristocratic and warrior cultures that would characterize the era. The Ashikaga Shogunate never achieved the centralized control of its Kamakura predecessor. Takauji had built his support by promising greater autonomy to regional warlords, and his government lacked the institutional strength to impose tight control over distant provinces. The Shugo, or provincial military governors, evolved from Bakufu representatives into powerful regional lords called Shugo daimyo, who maintained their own armies and administrative structures. While nominally loyal to the shogun, these magnates pursued their own interests and often engaged in power struggles with one another. The most capable of the Ashikaga shoguns, Yoshimitsu, the third shogun who ruled from 1368 to 1394, temporarily strengthened central authority through a combination of military pressure and shrewd alliance building. He brought an end to the imperial schism in 1392, convincing the southern court to surrender its imperial regalia and reunify the imperial line. Yoshimitsu also established formal trade relations with Ming China, ending a long hiatus in official contact between the two countries. The trade in luxury goods, Books and art objects fostered a new wave of continental cultural influence in Japan. Yoshimitsu's cultural patronage exemplified the distinctive synthesis of aristocratic refinement and samurai power that characterized the Muromachi period. He built the magnificent Kinkaku-ji, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, as a retirement villa that combined Japanese and Chinese architectural elements in spectacular harmony. The upper floors, covered in gold leaf and represented as pure expressions of aristocratic taste, while the ground floor exemplified samurai austerity. After his death, the villa was converted to a Zen temple according to his wishes, symbolizing the growing spiritual and aesthetic influence of Zen Buddhism on samurai culture. The Muromachi period saw unprecedented cultural flowering, particularly in the arts patronized by the warrior elite. The refined aesthetics of aristocratic culture merged with the spiritual depth of Zen Buddhism and the practical sensibilities of the samurai class to create distinctive art forms. Ink landscape painting, imported from China, but developed in uniquely Japanese directions, flourished under masters like Sesshu Toyo, whose landscapes captured both natural scenes and spiritual insight through masterful brush technique. The art of garden design reached new heights of sophistication, with dry landscape gardens using carefully arranged rocks, raked gravel, and minimal vegetation to suggest natural scenes and express philosophical concepts. No theatre emerged as a refined performance art combining dance, music, poetry, and masked drama. Developed by Kanami and his son Ziami under the patronage of Shogun Yoshimitsu, no distilled human experience to its essence, often focusing on supernatural encounters, spiritual transformation, and the lingering attachments of the dead to the world of the living. Its austere aesthetic, symbolic movements, and poetic text resonated with samurai values of discipline and emotional restraint, while incorporating aristocratic literary traditions. The tea ceremony evolved from casual gatherings for tea drinking into a highly formalized ritual art expressing core Zen principles. The wabi aesthetic, finding beauty in austerity, imperfection, and natural processes, guided the development of tea practice. Tea masters like Murata Juko and Takeno Ju established the spiritual and aesthetic foundations of the tea ceremony, which would reach its culmination in the next century under Sen no Rikyu. Through tea ceremony, samurai could cultivate mental discipline, aesthetic discernment, and spiritual insight within a structured social context. While cultural achievement flourished, political stability gradually eroded during the later Muromachi period. The Onin War, which erupted in 1467 as a succession dispute within the Ashikaga house, marked a turning point. What began as a conflict between rival factions in Kyoto spiraled into 11 years of destructive warfare that devastated the capital and spread throughout the provinces. By the time fighting subsided in 1477, central authority had effectively collapsed, and Japan entered the chaotic Sengoku period, the age of warring states. The Onin War demonstrated the deepening crisis in shogunal authority. Regional Shugo daimyo had grown increasingly independent, commanding their own bands of samurai retainers and governing their territories with minimal reference to the bakufu. The war accelerated the breakdown of traditional power structures as lower-ranking samurai seized opportunities to overthrow their superiors. A new class of daimyo emerged from this upheaval, the Sengoku daimyo, or warring states lords, who built their power through military strength rather than court appointments or shogunal recognition. Even as political fragmentation intensified, distinctive features of samurai culture continued to evolve. The aesthetic concept of yugen, a mysterious depth and profound grace, found expression in poetry, painting, and garden design. Samurai patrons valued suggestion over explicit statement, asymmetry over perfect balance, and natural materials over lavish ornamentation. These aesthetic preferences reflected both Zen influence and practical warrior sensibilities that equated simplicity with readiness for action and spiritual clarity. The samurai themselves underwent significant social evolution during this period. The ideal warrior was increasingly expected to master both cultural and martial arts. The concept of bunbu ryodo, or literary and military arts equally. A successful samurai needed not only fighting skills, but also administrative ability, cultural refinement, and spiritual depth. This broadening of samurai identity coincided with growing stratification within the warrior class itself, as high-ranking samurai distanced themselves from lower-ranking foot soldiers and mounted retainers. Religious life during the Muromachi period reflected the turbulent social landscape. Zen Buddhism maintained its appeal to the samurai elite, providing spiritual discipline complementary to warrior training. Pure Land Buddhism continued to attract commoners, with its promise of salvation through faith. True Pure Land Buddhism, an offshoot founded by Shinran, developed into an independent institution with its own temples, doctrines, and eventually military power. The Hoka, or Lotus sect, founded by Nichiren, likewise attracted passionate followers among both samurai and commoners, sometimes fomenting rebellions through its nationalist and apocalyptic teachings. By the end of the Muromachi period, the Ashikaga Shogunate existed in name only. The last Ashikaga shoguns were mere puppets controlled by whatever warlord happened to control Kyoto. The 15th Ashikaga shogun, Yoshiaki, was expelled from Kyoto in 1573 by the warlord Oda Nobunaga, effectively ending the shogunate, though Yoshiaki continued to claim the title until his death. Japan had fully entered the Sengoku period, an era of constant warfare that would test the samurai to their limits and ultimately forge a new, more unified feudal order from the crucible of conflict. The collapse of centralized authority following the Onin War plunged Japan into the tumultuous Sengoku period, an era of near-constant warfare lasting from the late 15th century until the early 17th century. The nominal authority of both emperor and shogun faded into insignificance as regional warlords battled for supremacy. Political power now derived purely from military strength, with traditional claims to legitimacy based on imperial appointment or aristocratic lineage carrying little weight. This violent age would test the samurai class to its limits, while paradoxically creating the conditions for Japan's eventual reunification. Across the Japanese archipelago, ambitious daimyo carved out territorial domains, building castles, recruiting samurai retainers, and developing administrative systems to extract resources from the peasantry. These Sengoku daimyo often rose from humble origins, with talented generals overthrowing their former lords and establishing new ruling houses. The old system of court-appointed governors gave way to a brutal meritocracy in which military success determined political survival. A popular saying of the time captured this social fluidity. The lowly can be raised up, the mighty can be brought down. Warfare evolved dramatically during this period of constant conflict. Traditional samurai preference for individual combat gave way to the practical necessities of mass warfare. Large infantry armies of ashigaru, or foot soldiers, recruited from the peasantry, became increasingly important on the battlefield. These commoner warriors carried spears, bows, and eventually firearms, fighting in coordinated units rather than as individual champions. The samurai remained the elite core of these armies, but their role shifted toward leadership and command rather than purely individual combat prowess. The introduction of European firearms in 1543, when Portuguese traders arrived on the island of Tanegashima, revolutionized Japanese warfare. The matchlock arquebus, called Tanegashima after the island, quickly spread throughout Japan as daimyo recognized its tactical value. Despite the samurai's traditional emphasis on swordsmanship and archery, pragmatic warlords rapidly incorporated gun units into their armies. By 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, Oda Nobunaga deployed 3,000 gunners in rotating volleys to shatter the charging cavalry of the Takeda clan, demonstrating how technology could overcome traditional samurai tactics. Castle construction flourished during the Sengoku period, as daimyo sought defensible headquarters for their domains. Earlier fortifications, typically simple wooden structures on hills or mountaintops, evolved into complex stone fortresses with multiple defensive layers. Innovations included stone foundations, multiple moats, angled walls to deflect projectiles, and strategically placed guard towers. These castles served not only as military strongholds, but also as administrative centers, symbols of daimyo authority, and eventually as impressive architectural achievements blending practical defense with aesthetic sophistication. The constant warfare forced significant innovations in military organization and logistics. Successful daimyo developed methods to recruit, train, supply, and command larger armies than ever before in Japanese history. Supply lines, field fortifications, intelligence networks, and siege techniques all evolved rapidly through practical necessity. Battlefield tactics became more sophisticated, with combined arms approaches integrating cavalry, infantry, archers, and gunners into coordinated operations. Written military manuals appeared, systematizing the accumulated wisdom of campaign experience. Military leaders of exceptional ability emerged during this chaotic period. Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin, fierce rivals who faced each other in 5 battles at Kawanakajima, became legendary for their strategic genius. Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon who lost an eye to smallpox in childhood, built a powerful domain in northern Japan through cunning diplomacy and fierce fighting. Mori Motonari unified Western Japan through careful alliance building and skillful defensive warfare. These and other regional warlords established distinctive styles of governance and military organization adapted to their specific circumstances. For the samurai class, the Sengoku period presented both opportunity and peril. Ambitious warriors could rise from obscurity to commanding positions through battlefield valor and strategic acumen. Conversely, even high-ranking samurai could lose everything in a single defeat. This environmental pressure intensified warrior values of loyalty, courage, and resignation to fate. The samurai developed a distinctive fatalism captured in the saying, "Life and death are but a feather's weight," expressing the ideal of detachment from concerns about survival when duty called for sacrifice. Despite the constant warfare, cultural and economic development continued during the Sengoku period. Regional daimyo patronized Zen Buddhism, tea ceremony, landscape gardening, and other arts as ways to display their sophistication and legitimate their rule. The aesthetic principle of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, transience, and simplicity, reached its mature expression during this turbulent era, perhaps as a philosophical response to the surrounding chaos and destruction. Tea master Sen no Rikyu brought the tea ceremony to its highest refinement under the patronage of both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, creating a ritual space where warriors could find spiritual tranquility amidst the turmoil of war. Commerce and manufacturing grew despite military disruption, with markets developing in castle towns and along transportation routes. Agricultural productivity increased through land reclamation, irrigation improvements, and new farming techniques. The unstable political situation actually stimulated economic activity in some regions as competing daimyo sought to maximize revenue from their territories. Maritime trade expanded through contacts with China, Korea, and European powers, bringing new goods, technologies, and ideas to Japan. Some daimyo actively encouraged commercial development, recognizing that economic strength underpinned military power. Religious institutions played complex roles during the Sengoku period. Buddhist monasteries, which had accumulated extensive landholdings and armed forces during earlier centuries, became independent political players. The Honganji, headquarters of the true Pure Land sect, commanded the loyalty of thousands of religious devotees called Iko-iki, who formed armies capable of challenging major daimyo. Other militant religious communities, like the Hokke-iki, formed around Nichiren Buddhist temples. These religious movements sometimes aligned with peasant uprisings against daimyo authority, creating formidable opposition to the established samurai class. The lives of ordinary people during this turbulent era were marked by hardship, but also by surprising resilience. Village communities developed self-governance mechanisms to protect local interests amid shifting political allegiances. Peasant uprisings became more common as the burden of taxation to support warfare grew increasingly onerous. Some villages negotiated directly with daimyo for protection, playing competing lords against each other. Urban populations in castle towns and trading centers grew, creating new social dynamics and cultural forms outside traditional agricultural life and samurai dominance. Women of the samurai class faced particularly challenging circumstances during the Sengoku period, while male family members fought in seemingly endless campaigns. Wives and daughters managed household affairs, maintained family alliances, and preserved samurai lineages. Some notable women took more direct roles in the conflicts. Lady Hosokawa Gracia, daughter of one warlord and wife of another, became famous for her Christian faith and dramatic suicide to avoid capture. Lady Iai of Hikone defended her castle against attacking forces after her husband's death. Lady Yodo, concubine of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, became a key political figure after his death, directing the defense of Osaka Castle against Tokugawa forces. By the mid-16th century, the chaotic competition among hundreds of independent daimyo began to resolve into larger patterns of alliance and conquest. The stage was set for the emergence of three remarkable leaders who would successively work toward the reunification of Japan. Oda Nobunaga, known for his ruthless innovation; Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant-born general of exceptional talent; and Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient strategist who would eventually establish Japan's final and most stable form of feudal rule. These three unifiers would transform the fragmented landscape of the Sengoku period into a centralized feudal state of unprecedented stability and cultural achievement. From the chaotic landscape of competing warlords, three extraordinary leaders emerged in succession to reunify Japan, each building upon the achievements of his predecessor while advancing the process of centralization. Oda Nobunaga initiated the unification through revolutionary military tactics and ruthless determination. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rising from peasant origins to become Nobunaga's successor, extended control over the entire country. Tokugawa Ieyasu, patiently biding his time and outlasting his rivals, established the stable political structure that would govern Japan for over 2.5 centuries. Oda Nobunaga, born in 1534 in Owari province, began as a minor daimyo controlling only part of a single province. Dismissive courtiers called him the Fool of Owari due to his eccentric behavior and humble territorial base. Yet beneath his unpredictable demeanor lay a brilliant military mind, open to innovation and unrestrained by tradition. After consolidating control of his home province by defeating rival branches of the Oda clan, Nobunaga began expanding his territory through a combination of military conquest, strategic alliances, and diplomatic maneuvering. Nobunaga's military innovations revolutionized Japanese warfare. He fully embraced firearms despite their challenge to traditional samurai combat values, organizing specialized units of arquebus troops trained to fire in coordinated volleys. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, these gunners decimated the previously invincible cavalry of the Takeda clan, demonstrating the new primacy of firepower over classical warrior skills. Nobunaga also reformed military organization, emphasizing disciplined infantry formations rather than individual samurai prowess, and developed sophisticated systems for logistics and supply that enabled sustained campaigns. Beyond military matters, Nobunaga implemented administrative reforms that strengthened central authority. He conducted comprehensive land surveys to rationalize taxation and clarify property rights. He eliminated toll barriers within his territories to promote commerce and disarmed the peasantry to prevent uprisings. His famous decree, the Rakuichi Rakuza policy, abolished monopolistic guilds and established free markets, stimulating economic activity in towns and cities throughout his domains. These policies not only increased his resource base for continued military campaigns, but also began transforming Japan's feudal economy. Religious institutions that challenged secular authority faced Nobunaga's particular wrath. The militant Buddhist monasteries of Mount Hiei, which had dominated political life in Kyoto for centuries, were destroyed in 1571, when Nobunaga's forces killed thousands of monks and burned the entire complex to the ground. The Ishiyama Honganji, fortress headquarters of the true Pure Land Buddhist sect, endured a decade-long siege before finally surrendering to Nobunaga's forces. These brutal campaigns against Buddhist power centers earned Nobunaga a reputation for ruthlessness, but removed significant obstacles to centralized political control. By 1582, Nobunaga had conquered central Japan and was positioned to complete national unification. On June 21st of that year, while staying at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, he was betrayed by his general Akechi Mitsuhide, who surrounded the temple with troops. Realizing his situation was hopeless, Nobunaga committed suicide, setting the temple ablaze around him in a final dramatic gesture. The incident at Honnoji cut short Nobunaga's ambitions, but created the opportunity for his most talented general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, to emerge as his successor. Hideyoshi's rise from humble origins to supreme ruler represents one of history's most remarkable social ascents. Born a peasant farmer's son in 1537, he entered Nobunaga's service as a sandal-bearer and rose through the ranks through sheer talent and determination. Lacking the samurai pedigree considered essential for leadership, Hideyoshi compensated with political cunning, psychological insight, and genuine military genius. After Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi quickly avenged his lord by defeating Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, establishing himself as Nobunaga's legitimate successor. Over the next decade, Hideyoshi systematically extended his control across Japan through a combination of military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives. The powerful Mori clan of Western Japan submitted to his authority. The Shimazu of Kyushu were defeated and forced to acknowledge his supremacy. By 1590, with the defeat of the Hojo clan at Odawara, Hideyoshi completed the military unification of Japan, accomplishing what neither the Minamoto shoguns, the Ashikaga, nor Nobunaga had achieved, bringing all daimyo under a single authority. Unable to claim the title of shogun due to his common birth, Hideyoshi obtained court titles of increasing prestige, eventually becoming imperial regent, Kampaku. He solidified his political position by marrying his sister to the young emperor Go-Yozei and adopting the surname Toyotomi, granted by the emperor. While maintaining the imperial institution as a source of legitimacy, Hideyoshi effectively controlled all significant political decisions, distributing territories to loyal vassals and requiring daimyo throughout Japan to swear personal loyalty to him. Hideyoshi implemented sweeping policies to transform Japanese society and prevent future challenges to central authority. The sword hunt of 1588 disarmed the peasantry by confiscating weapons under the guise of collecting metal for a giant Buddha statue. This policy not only reduced the threat of peasant uprisings, but also reinforced the social boundary between samurai and commoners. Hideyoshi's land surveys, more comprehensive than Nobunaga's, clarified property ownership, standardized taxation, and provided accurate information about the productive capacity of each region. Most significantly, Hideyoshi's class separation edicts formalized the social hierarchy that would characterize Edo period Japan. These decrees prohibited farmers from leaving their lands, merchants from adopting samurai status, and samurai from engaging in trade or farming. By freezing social mobility, Hideyoshi hoped to create a stable order, with each class performing its designated function. This rigid system contrasted sharply with the fluid social environment of the Sengoku period that had allowed Hideyoshi himself to rise from peasant to ruler. Cultural life flourished under Hideyoshi's patronage, despite his humble origins. He built a magnificent castle at Osaka that displayed unprecedented architectural grandeur. The tea ceremony reached its artistic pinnacle under tea master Sen no Rikyu, whom Hideyoshi appointed as his official tea advisor, before later ordering his suicide, possibly because the aesthetically austere values of the tea ceremony conflicted with Hideyoshi's growing preference for ostentatious display. The lavish golden tea room Hideyoshi constructed, covered entirely in gold leaf, exemplified his taste for spectacular manifestations of power and wealth. Hideyoshi's ambitions extended beyond Japan to the Asian mainland. In 1592, he launched a massive invasion of Korea with the ultimate goal of conquering Ming China. Despite initial successes, the Korean campaign bogged down in the face of fierce Korean resistance and Chinese intervention. A second invasion in 1597 made little headway before Hideyoshi's death. In 1598, led to the recall of Japanese forces. These failed continental adventures drained Japan's resources and created lasting enmity with Korea, but also spread Japanese cultural influence and brought Korean artisans to Japan, particularly potters whose techniques transformed Japanese ceramics. Before his death, Hideyoshi had made elaborate arrangements for his young son, Hideyori, to succeed him, establishing a council of 5 elders to govern as regents. Among these elders was Tokugawa Ieyasu, a powerful daimyo who had submitted to Hideyoshi after being a long-time ally of Oda Nobunaga. Patient, calculating, and profoundly strategic, Ieyasu would navigate the political turmoil following Hideyoshi's death to emerge as Japan's final unifier and the founder of its last feudal regime. The delicate political balance Hideyoshi had established collapsed almost immediately after his death. The Council of 5 Elders split into competing factions, with Tokugawa Ieyasu gradually positioning himself against those most loyal to Hideyoshi's memory and his heir, Hideyori. By 1600, two great alliances had formed: the Eastern Army, led by Ieyasu, and the Western Army, composed of daimyo opposing Tokugawa domination. The stage was set for the decisive battle that would determine Japan's political future. On October 21st, 1600, at the village of Sekigahara, the two massive forces clashed in the largest and most consequential battle in Japanese history. Through superior preparation, strategic positioning, and, critically, the defection of key Western Army generals during the battle, Ieyasu won a decisive victory. The Battle of Sekigahara established Tokugawa Ieyasu as Japan's paramount military and political leader, allowing him to redistribute land to reward allies and punish enemies, fundamentally reorganizing Japan's feudal structure to ensure Tokugawa dominance. 3 years after Sekigahara, in 1603, the emperor appointed Ieyasu as shogun, reviving the military title that had remained vacant since the fall of the Ashikaga. 2 years later, Ieyasu formally retired, passing the shogunal title to his son Hidetada, while continuing to wield power from behind the scenes. This established the precedent of retired shoguns maintaining influence, creating an additional layer of political stability. The one remaining threat to Tokugawa rule, Hideyoshi's son Hideyori at Osaka Castle, was eliminated in 1615 when Ieyasu's forces besieged and destroyed the castle, ending the Toyotomi lineage. With Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory, Japan's century of civil war finally ended. The three great unifiers had transformed Japan from a patchwork of warring states into a centralized feudal system under a single authority. Nobunaga had broken the back of old power structures through military innovation and ruthless determination. Hideyoshi had extended control across the entire country and implemented social reforms that would endure for centuries. Ieyasu had consolidated these achievements into a stable political system that would govern Japan until the modern era. Together, these three remarkable leaders had forged Japanese feudalism in its final and most developed form. The Tokugawa family established the most stable and long-lasting governing structure in Japanese history, moving the administrative center of Japan to Edo, modern Tokyo, symbolized a fresh start after centuries of warfare. The new political order, often called the Bakuhan system, balanced central authority with local autonomy in a carefully designed structure. The Tokugawa shogun directly controlled about 1/4 of Japan's agricultural land, strategically located around major cities and transportation routes. The remaining territory was divided among roughly 260 daimyo domains of varying sizes, whose lords governed with considerable autonomy while remaining subject to shogunal authority. To maintain control over these powerful regional lords, the Tokugawa implemented an ingenious system of checks and balances. Daimyo were classified into 3 categories based on their relationship to the Tokugawa family. Shinpan were related to the Tokugawa by blood and considered the most reliable allies. Fudai were those who had supported Ieyasu before the Battle of Sekigahara and occupied important administrative positions in the Bakufu government. Tozama, or outside lords, had submitted to Tokugawa authority only after Sekigahara and remained under greater suspicion and surveillance. The most famous control mechanism was the Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance system, instituted fully by 1635. This policy required daimyo to maintain 2 residences, one in their home domain and another in Edo, and to spend alternate years in each location. When daimyo returned to their domains, they had to leave their wives and heirs in Edo as hostages, ensuring their continued loyalty. This ingenious system served multiple purposes. It prevented rebellion by keeping daimyo under close observation, drained their financial resources through the expense of maintaining two establishments and traveling between them, exposed provincial lords to the cultural standards of the shogunal capital, and created a constant circulation of regional elites that helped unify the country culturally. The Tokugawa consolidated their rule by strictly controlling foreign contact through the sakoku, or closed country, policies. With memories of how European firearms had revolutionized warfare during the Sengoku period, and witnessing the colonization of Asian territories by European powers, the shogunate viewed foreign influence as a potential threat to stability. A series of edicts between 1633 and 1639 prohibited Japanese from traveling abroad or returning from overseas, restricted foreign traders to specific ports, expelled most European missionaries, and banned Christianity, which was viewed as a disruptive foreign ideology, potentially undermining shogunal authority. Only the Dutch maintained a European trading presence, confined to the tiny artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbor. Chinese merchants were similarly restricted, and Korean diplomats were allowed limited contact. This policy of controlled isolation was never absolute. Information and ideas continued to filter into Japan through these limited contact points, but it effectively insulated Japanese society from disruptive foreign influences, while the Tokugawa consolidated domestic control. The Tokugawa social order was formalized into a rigid four-class hierarchy. At the top stood the samurai, comprising roughly 6% of the population. Below them were farmers, considered honorable producers of essential food. Artisans occupied the third rank as creators of useful objects, while merchants ranked lowest despite their often substantial wealth, as they were seen as non-productive profiteers. Below this official structure were outcast groups, including the ETA, who performed unclean tasks such as leather tanning and disposing of dead animals, and the Hinin, including entertainers, prostitutes, and beggars. This hierarchical vision reflected Neo-Confucian ideals of social order, where each person had a defined role contributing to society's harmony. For the samurai class, the Tokugawa peace brought profound changes. No longer active warriors engaged in constant battle, samurai became administrators, bureaucrats, and scholars. This transformation created an identity crisis for a class defined by martial values, now living in an era of unprecedented peace. The ideal of the literate warrior, skilled in both cultural and martial arts, gained new emphasis. Samurai studied Confucian classics, practiced calligraphy, and composed poetry, while maintaining martial disciplines through practice rather than battlefield experience. Martial arts evolved into codified forms, emphasizing spiritual development alongside combat techniques, exemplified by the transition from battlefield swordsmanship to the ritualized practice of kendo. The economic foundation of samurai life also changed dramatically. Most samurai became stipended retainers, living in castle towns, rather than landholding lords directly managing rural estates. They received fixed stipends of rice from their daimyo masters, often inadequate for maintaining expected samurai lifestyles. This financial pressure, combined with the temptations of urban consumption, led many samurai into debt to wealthy merchant houses, creating a paradoxical situation where the officially highest-ranking social class became economically dependent on the lowest. Castle towns flourished throughout Japan as administrative centers and samurai residences. These planned urban spaces featured the daimyo castle at the highest point, surrounded by concentric rings of samurai districts organized by rank, with merchant and artisan quarters on the periphery. Edo itself grew into the world's largest city, with a population exceeding 1 million by 1700. Complex water management systems, fire prevention measures, and urban administration developed to manage these large settlements. The concentration of samurai in these urban centers stimulated demand for goods and services, creating vibrant commercial cultures despite official ideology, valorizing the rural farmer over the urban merchant. Outside the castle towns, village life continued under the close supervision of samurai officials. The village served as the basic unit of rural administration, collectively responsible for tax payments, maintaining order, and implementing shogunal directives. Village headmen, usually wealthy farmers, mediated between samurai authorities and the farming population. The annual rice tax, typically collecting between 40 to 60% of the harvest, flowed from villages to daimyo treasuries, and ultimately supported the elaborate samurai governmental structure and lifestyle. Agricultural production increased significantly during the early Edo period through land reclamation, irrigation improvements, new farming tools, fertilization techniques, and more intensive cultivation methods. Double cropping became more common, and commercial crops such as cotton, indigo, sugar, and tobacco supplemented rice cultivation. This agricultural surplus supported population growth, urbanization, and the expansion of handicraft industries and trade networks, gradually transforming Japan's feudal economy despite official policies aimed at preserving traditional social and economic patterns. The intellectual foundation of Tokugawa rule rested primarily on Neo-Confucianism, particularly the Jushi school from China, that emphasized social hierarchy, proper relationships, and moral cultivation. This philosophy provided ethical justification for samurai rule and the rigid social order, teaching that social harmony depended on each person fulfilling their proper role with sincerity and dedication. Confucian academies trained samurai administrators in the classics, history, and ethical principles needed for governance. The Tokugawa Shogunate established the Shoheiko in Edo as the official academy for bakufu retainers, while daimyo domains created their own schools for local samurai education. Buddhist institutions, formerly independent political and military powers, were brought under strict governmental control. The Tokugawa implemented the danka system, requiring every household to register with a Buddhist temple, primarily to eradicate Christianity, but also to create comprehensive population records. Temples became integrated into the administrative structure, performing quasi-governmental functions such as registration of births, deaths, and marriages. While Buddhist doctrinal development stagnated under this state control, temple complexes remained important cultural centers, preserving artistic traditions, manuscript collections, and ceremonial practices. Shinto, Japan's indigenous religious tradition, experienced a revival of scholarly interest during the early Edo period. Scholars like Yamaga Soko and Motoori Norinaga began researching ancient Japanese texts and practices, seeking to identify a pure Japanese tradition distinct from imported Chinese and Buddhist elements. This nativist scholarship, while initially an academic pursuit, would eventually contribute to intellectual currents challenging the theoretical basis of Tokugawa rule. The early Edo period witnessed remarkable cultural fluorescence as peace and urban growth created audiences and patrons for new art forms. The licensed pleasure districts, most famously the Yoshiwara in Edo, developed sophisticated entertainment cultures combining music, dance, fashion, and literary wit. Kabuki theatre evolved from ribald street performances into a major dramatic art form, with professional troupes, purpose-built theatres, and star actors. Bunraku puppet theatre reached artistic maturity with sophisticated mechanical puppets, emotional musical accompaniment, and dramatic texts by master playwrights like Chikamatsu Monzemon, whose historical dramas and domestic tragedies explored the conflict between social obligation and personal feeling at the heart of Edo period moral dilemmas. By the mid-17th century, the Tokugawa had established a remarkably stable and well-articulated governing system that would endure with relatively minor adjustments for more than 2 centuries. The traumas of the Sengoku period faded into historical memory as generations grew up knowing only the Pax Tokugawa. The samurai class, no longer defined by battlefield prowess, developed new identities as administrators, scholars, and cultural arbiters. Japan entered a period of isolation, but not stagnation, as dynamic internal developments in economy, society, and culture continued within the framework of Tokugawa feudal institutions. The samurai class during the Edo period lived according to an elaborate code of conduct that governed virtually every aspect of their existence. Bushido, the way of the warrior, reached its most developed form not during the centuries of warfare, but paradoxically during the long Tokugawa peace. This ethical code emphasized loyalty, honor, self-discipline, and death, rather than dishonor. Drawing from Confucian ethics, Zen Buddhist philosophy, and indigenous Japanese traditions, Bushido provided a moral framework that justified samurai's social dominance while channeling warrior energies into acceptable forms during an era when actual warfare had largely disappeared. The daily life of a samurai varied considerably depending on rank and wealth. High-ranking samurai served as senior administrators in domain governments, advised daimyo lords on policy matters, and enjoyed comfortable material circumstances with spacious residences and numerous servants. Middle-ranking samurai filled specialized bureaucratic positions requiring literacy and administrative skills. The lowest-ranking samurai, forming the majority of the warrior class, lived in modest circumstances not far removed from commoner standards, working as clerks, guards, or minor officials while struggling to maintain appearances appropriate to samurai status. The typical samurai residence in a castle town reflected both status considerations and practical needs. Houses faced south for optimal light and were arranged hierarchically, with higher-ranking samurai living closer to the daimyo castle. The main entrance, protected by a roofed gate, led to a reception area where visitors waited and lower-status individuals could speak with household members without entering the main dwelling. Interior spaces were divided by sliding paper doors and floor mats of standardized size. Decorative elements were restrained, with simple calligraphy scrolls and flower arrangements in alcoves called tokonoma, serving as focal points. Gardens, even very small ones, provided aesthetic pleasure and reflected the samurai ideal of finding beauty in disciplined nature. Samurai education emphasized both literary and martial training, the twin paths of the ideal warrior. Boys began studying Chinese classics, calligraphy, history, and mathematics from age 6 or 7, often attending domain schools established for samurai children. Martial training included swordsmanship, archery, spear fighting, horsemanship, and military tactics. The goal was to develop both physical skills and proper mindset, the ability to act decisively without hesitation or fear. Famous martial arts schools like the Yagyu Shinkage-ryu for swordsmanship developed elaborate technical systems and philosophical approaches that transformed combat techniques into paths for character development. The iconic samurai weapons and armor evolved into refined forms during the Edo period, becoming as much status symbols as practical equipment. The samurai sword, or katana, was considered the soul of the samurai and treated with ritualized respect. Master swordsmiths like Miyamoto Musashi created blades of legendary quality through techniques combining practical metallurgy with religious significance. Formal armor became increasingly ornate and ceremonial as actual battlefield use diminished, with elaborate helmets featuring distinctive crests identifying individual warriors. The right to wear two swords, the longer katana and shorter wakizashi, visibly distinguished samurai from commoners in everyday life. Daily routine for a typical middle-ranking samurai involved rising early, performing morning ablutions, and paying respects at the household shrine or Buddhist altar. After a simple breakfast, he would proceed to administrative duties at his lord's castle or government office. Work might include document preparation, tax assessment, dispute resolution, or inspection of public works. Meals were based on rice with side dishes of vegetables, fish, and occasionally meat. Evenings involved administrative paperwork, self-improvement through reading historical or philosophical texts, martial arts practice, or cultural pursuits such as poetry composition, calligraphy, or musical performance. Formal etiquette governed samurai's social interactions, with elaborate protocols determining proper greetings, seating arrangements, gift exchanges, and conversational topics based on relative status. The proper way to bow, sit, enter a room, or address superiors was instilled through rigorous training from childhood. This emphasis on correct form reflected the Confucian belief that proper external behavior cultivated internal virtue and the practical need to maintain clear status distinctions in a hierarchical society. Even casual encounters followed prescribed patterns that signaled mutual recognition of social position. Marriage for samurai was primarily a political and economic alliance between families, rather than a relationship based on personal attraction. Marriages were arranged by family heads or domain authorities, often to strengthen political bonds or consolidate resources. The bride brought a dowry of household goods, clothing, and sometimes cash, while the groom's family provided living arrangements. The wife's primary duties included managing the household, supervising servants, educating young children, maintaining family accounts, and producing heirs. Despite these practical foundations, many samurai marriages developed into partnerships of genuine emotional depth over time. The samurai household operated as a multi-generational unit, continuing through time rather than as a nuclear family. Family headship passed from father to eldest son, with younger sons either establishing branch families or remaining as dependents. The household included not only blood relatives, but also adopted members, a common practice to ensure family continuation when biological heirs were lacking, and sometimes unrelated retainers or servants. Family graves, ancestral tablets, and household records provided tangible connections to lineage history, emphasizing the individual's responsibility to maintain family honor and pass it untarnished to future generations. Samurai recreation balanced cultural refinement with martial spirit. Literary pursuits included poetry, composition, often in structured social gatherings, where participants composed verses following established themes. Appreciation of painting, calligraphy, and flower arrangement provided aesthetic pleasure while reinforcing cultural values of restraint and disciplined beauty. The tea ceremony evolved into a highly formalized ritual embodying wabi-sabi aesthetics of transience and imperfection, providing spiritual contemplation within a structured social context. Musical accomplishment on instruments like the shakuhachi flute or shamisen lute demonstrated cultural refinement. Physical recreation maintained martial readiness while serving social and political functions. Archery competitions, originally religious rituals, became tests of concentration and technical skill. Sumo wrestling codified with elaborate rituals and technical classifications, developed from battlefield grappling techniques into a specialized combat sport. Hunting, restricted by shogunal regulations to certain areas and seasons, maintained skills in horsemanship and weapon use. These activities reinforced samurai identity as warriors, even in peaceful times, and provided arenas for demonstrating physical prowess and building bonds with peers. Spiritual life for samurai typically included elements from multiple religious traditions. Confucianism provided ethical principles for daily conduct and social relationships. Buddhism offered perspectives on impermanence and detachment, valuable for warriors who needed to face death without fear. Shinto practices honored ancestors and natural forces. Many samurai maintained household shrines for both Buddhist contemplation and Shinto observances, participating in public festivals and ceremonies according to the ritual calendar. Religious observance was integrated with social duty and personal discipline, rather than compartmentalized as a separate sphere of life. The Zen Buddhist influence on samurai culture was particularly pronounced in aesthetic values and philosophical outlook. Zen emphasis on direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge resonated with warrior pragmatism. The aesthetic principles of simplicity, suggestion rather than explicit statement, and finding beauty in austerity shaped samurai taste in everything, from garden design to food presentation. Zen-influenced arts like ink painting, haiku poetry, and the tea ceremony cultivated mental stillness and heightened awareness of the present moment, qualities equally valuable in combat and administration. The samurai relationship with death formed a distinctive aspect of their culture. Following the principle that the way of the samurai is found in death, warriors were expected to maintain constant awareness of mortality and readiness to die with dignity when circumstances required. Ritual suicide, seppuku, represented the ultimate demonstration of samurai resolve, converting inevitable death into a final act of self-determination and honor. Originally a battlefield practice ensuring warriors would not be captured, seppuku evolved into a highly ritualized ceremony with specific protocols for different circumstances, including formal punishment, protest against unjust treatment, or atonement for failure. As the Edo period progressed, tensions developed between idealized samurai values and the realities of peacetime bureaucratic life. Fictional tales and theatrical productions increasingly romanticized the heroic samurai of earlier eras who faced clear moral choices on the battlefield, contrasting with the complex ethical compromises required of Edo period administrators. This nostalgia for a more straightforward warrior past influenced how later generations, both Japanese and foreign, would understand samurai identity. The reality of samurai life was always more complex and contradictory than the idealized portrayal, encompassing both noble self-sacrifice and pragmatic self-interest, refined aesthetic sensibility and brutal enforcement of social hierarchy. Throughout the Edo period, samurai culture gradually penetrated other social classes, despite official separation policies. Wealthy merchants adopted samurai aesthetic tastes and educational practices. Farmers incorporated elements of samurai ethical codes into village moral structures. Even outcast groups developed honor codes resembling Bushido principles. This cultural diffusion created a distinctively Japanese civilization that transcended class boundaries while maintaining the formal structures of feudal hierarchy. The samurai class, though relatively small in numbers, thus exerted influence far beyond its demographic weight, establishing cultural patterns that would endure even after the formal abolition of the feudal system in the modern era. The lives of women in samurai households reflected the complex intersection of class privilege and gender constraints in feudal Japan. While experiencing significant restrictions compared to their male counterparts, samurai women nevertheless occupied positions of considerable responsibility and influence that distinguished them from women of other social classes. Their experiences varied dramatically based on household rank, wealth, and individual circumstances, creating a diverse picture that defies simple generalization. Educational standards for daughters of samurai families were remarkably high compared to contemporary societies worldwide. Young girls studied classical literature, calligraphy, poetry composition, music, and tea ceremony, alongside practical household management skills. The goal was to produce cultured women capable of maintaining household affairs, educating children, and representing family honor in social interactions. While different from male education, with its emphasis on military skills and administrative knowledge, samurai women's education created a high level of literacy and cultural refinement that influenced Japanese feminine ideals for centuries. The moral code governing samurai women centered on the Confucian virtues of obedience, modesty, self-discipline, and loyalty. The influential text Onna Daigaku, or Greater Learning for Women, codified these expectations, instructing women to demonstrate absolute loyalty to their husband's household and subordinate personal desires to family interests. While superficially similar to the restrictions placed on commoner women, these principles carried distinctive implications for samurai women, whose behavior reflected not only on themselves, but on their husband's honor and their family's status within the hierarchical warrior class. Marriage patterns for samurai women differed significantly from those of other classes. Marriages were arranged as political and economic alliances between families rather than personal choices. A samurai daughter typically married in her mid-teens to a somewhat older man, selected by family elders, often from a family of comparable rank with useful political connections. The bride moved physically and legally from her birth family to her husband's household, transferring her primary loyalty accordingly. While commoner marriages allowed somewhat greater flexibility and even the possibility of divorce by mutual consent, samurai marriages were more rigidly controlled due to their political implications. Upon joining her husband's household, the samurai wife assumed significant managerial responsibilities. She oversaw domestic servants, managed household finances, maintained family records, supervised food preparation, directed textile production, and ensured proper observation of religious rituals and social obligations. During her husband's frequent absences for official duties or mandatory attendance in Edo under the Sankin Kotai system, she might effectively govern the household independently for extended periods. This administrative role required practical intelligence, organizational skill, and diplomatic ability in managing both subordinates and relations with other samurai households. The production of male heirs represented a crucial obligation for samurai wives, ensuring the continuation of the family line and preserving its status and stipend rights. Failure to produce a son could lead to the husband taking a concubine or adopting a male heir, potentially marginalizing the wife's position. This reproductive pressure shaped women's experiences significantly, though the practice of adoption provided some flexibility in the system. A wife who produced a male heir secured her position within the household and gained influence through her relationship with the future family head. Beyond biological reproduction, samurai mothers took primary responsibility for their children's early education and moral development. Sons remained under maternal supervision until approximately age 7, when formal martial and academic training began under male teachers. daughters typically remained under their mother's guidance until marriage, learning both practical skills and cultural accomplishments needed for their future roles as samurai wives. This educational responsibility gave mothers significant influence in transmitting cultural values and shaping the next generation of the warrior class. While samurai women rarely participated directly in combat, historical records and literary accounts describe exceptions during times of crisis. The most famous example was Tomoe Gozen, who fought alongside her lord during the Genpei War and was renowned for her skill with the naginata, a pole weapon with a curved blade particularly associated with female martial training. During castle sieges in the Sengoku period, some samurai women defended their homes alongside male warriors. The naginata eventually evolved from a battlefield weapon into a symbolic martial art practiced by samurai daughters as both physical training and character development, emphasizing the distinctive status of warrior class women. The aesthetic and cultural contributions of samurai women significantly influenced Japanese civilization. Literary works by samurai women included poetry, diaries, and creative prose that contributed to the Japanese literary tradition. Women of the warrior class preserved and transmitted traditional arts like the tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and classical music within their households and through teaching. Their patronage supported artisans and performers, while their taste shaped evolving standards of refinement in clothing, interior design, and ceremonial practices. This cultural influence extended beyond the samurai class, as wealthy merchant families increasingly emulated samurai women's accomplishments and aesthetic sensibilities. The political influence of samurai women, while usually exercised indirectly, could be substantial. As mothers of future leaders, wives of current officials, and managers of household networks, they possessed channels of influence that operated alongside formal, male-dominated political structures. Some achieved direct political power as regents for underage sons or as advisors to male relatives. The most dramatic examples came during succession disputes or periods of crisis, when women like Lady Kasuga, nurse to the third Tokugawa shogun, or Lady Yodo, mother of Toyotomi Hideyori, emerged as significant political actors, defending family interests against powerful rivals. Religious life offered samurai women spiritual resources and occasional alternatives to conventional married life. Buddhism provided philosophical perspectives on impermanence and suffering that resonated with the constraints of women's lives. Pure Land Buddhist sects, with their emphasis on faith rather than elaborate rituals, attracted many female devotees. Some samurai daughters entered Buddhist convents rather than marrying, particularly during the Sengoku period, when political uncertainty made religious life an attractive alternative. These female monastics sometimes achieved significant learning and spiritual authority, founding temples and teaching both male and female disciples. The position of samurai women evolved over the course of the Edo period, generally becoming more restricted as the Tokugawa peace solidified gender norms. During the turbulent Sengoku period, necessity had often pushed samurai women into active roles managing domains, while male relatives fought campaigns. With the establishment of prolonged peace, stricter interpretations of Confucian gender hierarchy gained influence, gradually limiting women's public activities and strengthening male authority within households. This trend affected urban samurai families more strongly than rural warrior households, where practical needs often trumped ideological prescriptions. Clothing and personal appearance visibly marked samurai women's distinct status. Married women of the warrior class traditionally blackened their teeth with a dye called ohaguro and shaved their eyebrows, painting artificial ones higher on the forehead, practices that signified maturity and married status. Their kimonos featured family crests indicating lineage and rank, using subdued colors and patterns that distinguished them from the more flamboyant styles favored by wealthy merchant women. Hairstyles, ornaments, and accessories followed strict conventions indicating age, marital status, and position within the hierarchy of samurai society. Daily life for samurai women centered on the interior spaces of the household, particularly the private family quarters, separated from the more public reception rooms where male household members conducted official business. While this spatial division reflected gender norms restricting women's public presence, it also created female-dominated domains where women exercised significant authority. The inner quarters became centers of cultural production and transmission, where poetry was composed, music performed, and artistic skills refined. These female spaces thus paradoxically represented both restriction and a realm of specialized expertise and authority. The experiences of samurai women challenged simplistic narratives about gender in feudal Japan. While clearly subordinate to male authority in formal power structures, they nevertheless wielded significant influence through household management, cultural accomplishment, maternal authority, and personal relationships. Their lives embodied the tension between constraint and agency that characterized feudal Japanese society more broadly, where rigidly hierarchical formal structures coexisted with complex networks of obligation, affection, and practical necessity. Understanding their multifaceted roles provides essential insight into how the samurai class maintained its cultural and political dominance throughout the feudal period. Beneath the apparent serenity of Tokugawa rule lay persistent tensions that occasionally erupted into open rebellion. The Tokugawa peace was maintained not by universal consent, but through sophisticated systems of surveillance, legal control, and strategic application of force. The shogunate and domain governments developed elaborate mechanisms to monitor potential threats, suppress dissent, and maintain the rigid social order essential to feudal stability. These systems of control and the rebellions they sought to prevent reveal the underlying power dynamics that sustained Japanese feudalism for centuries. The most famous rebellion of the early Edo period occurred in 1637 to 1638, when Christian peasants and masterless samurai rose up in the Shimabara Peninsula and nearby Amakusa Islands. The Shimabara Rebellion, led by the charismatic youth Amakusa Shiro, drew together approximately 37,000 rebels driven by religious persecution, excessive taxation, and local grievances against harsh domain administration. The uprising required a massive shogunal response, with over 125,000 troops besieging the rebels' fortress at Hara Castle for several months. When the castle finally fell, virtually all rebels were executed, regardless of age or gender. This comprehensive suppression reflected Tokugawa determination to eliminate Christianity, which they viewed as an ideological threat to stable rule, and to demonstrate overwhelming force against any challenge to established authority. Following the Shimabara Rebellion, the shogunate intensified its anti-Christian policies. The religious registry system required all Japanese to register with a Buddhist temple, which would certify their non-Christian status. Suspected Christians were forced to perform fumi, the ritual stepping on Christian images, to prove their rejection of the faith. Those who refused faced torture and execution. These measures effectively drove Christianity underground, where small communities of hidden Christians maintained their faith in secret for over 2 centuries, blending Christian beliefs with Buddhist and Shinto elements to avoid detection. Beyond religious rebellion, peasant uprisings constituted the most common form of resistance to feudal authority. Over the course of the Edo period, thousands of peasant protests occurred throughout Japan, driven by excessive taxation, corrupt local officials, rice shortages, and natural disasters. Most began as organized petitions and demonstrations, following established protocols for expressing grievances to authorities. When these formal channels failed, protests might escalate to Yonaoshi Ikki, or World Rectification uprisings, where peasants destroyed property of wealthy merchants, attacked local officials, or occupied government offices. The shogunate and domained governments developed sophisticated strategies for managing these rural tensions. Initial violent suppression was typically followed by strategic concessions, addressing the most egregious grievances while punishing identified ringleaders. This carrot-and-stick approach maintained the formal authority structure while releasing pressure that might otherwise threaten the entire system. Local officials served as crucial intermediaries, absorbing peasant anger while communicating acceptable demands to higher authorities. This pattern of controlled protest, selective repression, and limited reform characterized the dynamic stability of Tokugawa rural governance. Urban rebellions presented different challenges to feudal authorities. Crowded cities with concentrated populations of artisans, day laborers, and servants could erupt into destructive riots during food shortages or in response to perceived injustice. The Edo riots of 1733 and 1787, known as Uchikawashi, involved systematic destruction of wealthy merchants' property following rice price spikes. Urban commoners expressed collective grievances through anonymous satirical writings posted in public places, spreading discontent that authorities struggled to trace and suppress. The concentrated populations and economic importance of cities made urban unrest particularly threatening to the feudal order. Among the samurai class, political conflict typically took the form of domain succession disputes or factional struggles within domain governments, rather than open rebellion against the shogunate. When disagreements over succession or policy reached an impasse, rival factions might appeal to the shogunate to adjudicate, leveraging bakufu authority to advance their position. The most dramatic samurai resistance came from ronin, masterless samurai whose severed lord-vassal relationships placed them outside normal control mechanisms. Groups of ronin periodically plotted to attack shogunal officials or foment larger uprisings, though most such conspiracies were discovered and suppressed before implementation. The most celebrated incident involving ronin was the 1702 vendetta of the 47 samurai of Akko domain. After their lord was forced to commit seppuku for attacking a shogunal official who had insulted him, these loyal retainers spent 2 years planning revenge while appearing to have abandoned their samurai values. Their eventual success in executing a coordinated attack that killed their lord's enemy created a profound dilemma for shogunal authorities. The vendetta violated explicit prohibitions against private revenge but exemplified the samurai virtues of loyalty and perseverance. After considerable deliberation, the shogunate ordered the ronin to commit seppuku, an honorable punishment acknowledging both their crime and their adherence to Bushido principles. The 47 ronin incident rapidly entered popular culture through dramatic adaptations, woodblock prints, and oral storytelling. These portrayals generally celebrated the ronin as paragons of samurai virtue, while depicting shogunal officials as bureaucratic legalists disconnected from true warrior values. This romanticization of rebellion, in carefully circumscribed circumstances, revealed tensions within samurai identity during the peaceful Edo period. The tale's enormous popularity suggested a widespread nostalgia for more heroic expressions of samurai values than were possible within the highly regulated Tokugawa order. The shogunate maintained comprehensive surveillance systems to identify potential threats before they materialized. The Metsuke, or inspectors, formed an intelligence network monitoring daimyo activities, government officials, and potential sources of unrest. Traveling in disguise, these agents gathered information on local conditions, popular sentiment, and possible conspiracies. In Edo, the overstretched police force of Yorike and Doshin was supplemented by networks of informants drawn from outcast communities, who monitored gambling dens, unlicensed brothels, and other criminal gathering places. Domain governments maintained similar systems within their territories, creating overlapping webs of surveillance throughout Japanese society. Legal control represented another pillar of Tokugawa authority. The shogunate issued comprehensive legal codes governing everything from acceptable clothing for different classes to procedures for traveling between domains. Domain governments promulgated their own local regulations within this national framework. Punishments were public and severe, designed to deter through example rather than rehabilitate offenders. Criminal suspects faced detention and interrogation under torture until they confessed, with few procedural protections. This harsh penal system, while arbitrary by modern standards, created clear boundaries for acceptable behavior within the rigid feudal order. Physical movement throughout Japan was carefully regulated through the sekisho, or barrier station system. These checkpoints on major roads examined travelers' documentation, particularly focusing on weapons transportation and unauthorized movement of women and children. The most stringent inspection occurred at barriers controlling access to Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka, as well as those separating different domains. This system aimed primarily to enforce the Sankin Kotai system by preventing daimyo families from leaving Edo without permission and controlling potential rebel movements between regions. Within this controlling framework, however, Japanese society maintained remarkable internal stability compared to contemporary societies worldwide. Violent crime rates remained relatively low, and most people experienced the feudal order not primarily as oppression, but as a predictable structure within which they could pursue limited but meaningful life goals. The emphasis on group responsibility, from the village level to the domain level, created strong social pressure for conformity and self-regulation. Communities managed minor conflicts internally through mediation and social sanctions, minimizing the need for direct intervention by samurai authorities. The Tokugawa system thus balanced firm control with pragmatic flexibility, maintaining core feudal hierarchies while allowing sufficient adaptability to address changing conditions. This dynamic stability characterized Japanese feudalism at its most developed stage, creating a society that preserved traditional structures while gradually evolving new social and economic patterns within the formal feudal framework. The relative rarity of large-scale rebellion, despite significant internal tensions, testified to the sophisticated governance mechanisms developed through centuries of feudal experimentation. As the Tokugawa peace extended into its second century, profound economic and social transformations occurred beneath the apparently unchanging feudal structure. The rigid four-class hierarchy and formal political institutions remained intact, but the actual distribution of wealth, influence, and cultural authority shifted dramatically. These changes created increasing tensions between feudal ideology and social reality, gradually undermining the foundations of samurai dominance while creating new cultural forms that would shape Japanese modernity. The most significant economic development was the steady growth of a sophisticated commercial economy, increasingly divorced from the agrarian foundations of feudal society. Osaka emerged as the commercial center of Japan, where rice collected as tax revenue from domains throughout the country was converted into cash through commodity markets. Professional merchants developed complex financial instruments, including futures contracts, bills of exchange, and commercial paper. Domain governments increasingly relied on wealthy merchant houses like the Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Konoike families for loans to cover expenses, creating financial relationships that contradicted the official ideology, placing merchants at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Urban growth continued throughout the period, with Edo surpassing 1 million residents to become the world's largest city. Other castle towns and trading centers like Osaka and Kyoto similarly expanded, creating unprecedented concentrations of non-agricultural population. These urban areas developed distinctive cultures centered on the chonin, or townspeople, including merchants, artisans, entertainers, and service providers of all kinds. Freed from many rural social constraints and often possessing considerable disposable income, urban commoners patronized theaters, pleasure quarters, restaurants, and other commercial entertainment, creating a vibrant popular culture that gradually overshadowed traditional elite arts. The samurai class faced increasing economic distress as their fixed stipends failed to keep pace with the commercialization of the economy. While rice remained the official medium for samurai compensation, its real value fluctuated with market conditions beyond their control. Many samurai fell into debt to merchant financiers, creating the painful paradox of the officially highest-ranking class becoming economically dependent on the lowest. Domain governments faced similar financial pressures, with many engaging in desperate expedients, including currency debasement, forced loans from wealthy merchants, and increased peasant taxation. This economic precarity intensified status anxiety among samurai, who struggled to maintain appearances appropriate to their rank. The growing gap between feudal ideology and socio-economic reality generated various responses from the Tokugawa regime. The shogunate periodically attempted to reverse commercialization through sumptuary laws, limiting merchant luxury, currency reforms to stabilize rice values, and moral exhortations promoting frugality and traditional values. These reform efforts, most notably those led by shogunal advisors Matsudaira Sadanobu in the 1790s and Mizuno Tadakuni in the 1840s, achieved temporary effects, but could not permanently reverse the underlying economic transformation. Each attempted return to feudal fundamentals was followed by renewed commercial growth, once reform momentum faded. Rural Japan also experienced significant changes during this period. Agricultural innovations, including new seed varieties, fertilization techniques, irrigation improvements, and double cropping increased productivity substantially. Commercial agriculture spread as farmers shifted from subsistence production to specialized crops with higher market value, including cotton, indigo, sugar, tobacco, and rapeseed. Villages became increasingly differentiated internally between wealthy farming families with substantial land holdings and marginal cultivators, who supplemented agricultural income with handicraft production, wage labor, or seasonal migration to cities. These rural transformations created new patterns of inequality and economic interdependence beyond traditional feudal relationships. Proto-industrial production developed in both rural and urban areas, particularly in textiles, sake brewing, paper making, and ceramic production. Putting out systems emerged where merchant coordinators distributed raw materials to rural households for processing, before collecting finished or semi-finished goods for distribution. Urban workshops organized production along increasingly specialized lines, with master craftsmen overseeing apprentices and journeymen, in producing consumer goods for expanding markets. While these arrangements remained largely household-based rather than factory-centered, they represented significant steps toward industrial organization and created new forms of labor discipline outside traditional status hierarchies. The cultural life of the middle to late Edo period reflected these socio-economic transformations. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints depicted the floating world of urban pleasure districts, kabuki actors, beautiful courtesans, and later, famous landscapes and historical scenes. Innovative literary forms emerged, including sharebon, entertaining books about pleasure quarter customs, kibiyoshi, satirical picture books often mocking samurai pretensions, and yomihon, complex adventure and supernatural tales. These popular arts flourished despite periodic censorship campaigns targeting content deemed subversive to feudal values or public morality. Kabuki theater reached artistic maturity during this period, developing sophisticated staging techniques, iconic performance styles, and classic plays that remain in the repertoire today. Star actors like Ichikawa Danjuro became cultural celebrities whose portraits, acting styles, and personal lives fascinated the urban public. While officially considered disreputable entertainment appropriate only for commoners, kabuki gradually attracted elite patronage, with samurai attending performances in disguise. The theaters themselves became important social spaces where different classes mixed informally in ways impossible within the official status system. The licensed pleasure quarters, particularly Edo's Yoshiwara and Osaka's Shinmachi, developed elaborate cultural codes governing everything from appropriate conversation to seasonal fashion trends. High-ranking courtesans required extensive arts training and commanded prices only wealthy merchants could afford. Their establishments became important cultural salons, where patrons displayed refinement through poetry composition, calligraphy, musical performance, and witty conversation. This sophisticated entertainment world inverted conventional status hierarchies, with merchant wealth purchasing access to cultural capital traditionally associated with elite education. Traditional elite cultural forms continued alongside these popular developments, but increasingly reflected changing social realities. The tea ceremony, traditionally associated with samurai aesthetic values, attracted wealthy merchant practitioners who built elaborate tea rooms and collected valuable utensils. Classical Japanese poetry and linked verse composition remained important markers of education, but incorporated new themes from urban commoner life. Scholarly pursuits, including medicine, botany, mathematics, and historical research, flourished among both samurai intellectuals and educated commoners, creating overlapping communities of knowledge transcending status boundaries. The Middle Edo period witnessed Japan's first significant encounter with Western scientific knowledge through the policy of rangaku, or Dutch learning. The small Dutch trading post at Dejima in Nagasaki harbor provided the sole official window to European developments. Japanese scholars, initially focused on practical medical knowledge, gradually expanded their interests to astronomy, geography, botany, physics, and military science. Government restrictions limited this learning, requiring official permission for rangaku studies and censoring potentially disruptive information. Nevertheless, awareness of Western scientific advancement gradually spread among educated elites, creating intellectual ferment despite Japan's formal isolation. Religious life during this period reflected both institutional stability and significant undercurrents of popular spirituality outside official structures. Established Buddhist sects maintained their formal relationships with parishioner households, but often became ritualized and formalistic. Folk religious practices flourished, including pilgrimages to famous shrines and temples. household divination, and local festivals honoring kami and ancestors. New religious movements occasionally emerged, combining elements from various traditions with charismatic leadership and promises of healing or salvation, though authorities usually suppressed these as potential threats to social order. By the late Edo period, this complex social reality increasingly strained against the formal feudal structure. Wealthy merchants with generations of cultural refinement found the official hierarchy that placed them beneath impoverished samurai increasingly arbitrary. Educated commoners questioned traditional justifications for status distinctions. Domain governments struggled with chronic financial problems, while witnessing the prosperity of the commercial sector. They could tax only indirectly. The samurai class faced a growing identity crisis as their military function became increasingly vestigial, while their administrative role was partially supplanted by competent commoner clerks and managers. These internal tensions might have continued evolving gradually. Within the Tokugawa framework, had external pressures not forced more rapid change. The appearance of Russian, British, and American ships in Japanese waters, with increasing frequency from the late 18th century onward, confronted the shogunate with unprecedented diplomatic and military challenges. The comfortable isolation that had allowed Japanese feudalism to develop its distinctive patterns was becoming untenable in a rapidly changing global environment. The stage was being set for the dramatic final act of the feudal era, when Japan would confront both internal contradictions and external threats that would ultimately transform samurai society beyond recognition. The long peace of the Tokugawa era created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual exploration and debate. Freed from the constant disruption of warfare that had characterized previous centuries, scholars, samurai, and educated commoners engaged in wide-ranging discussions about ethics, governance, history, and Japan's place in the world. These intellectual currents flowed beneath the seemingly placid surface of Tokugawa society, gradually reshaping fundamental assumptions about legitimate authority and social organization. While initially serving to justify and strengthen feudal institutions, Japanese thought eventually developed perspectives that would contribute to feudalism's ultimate transformation. Neo-Confucianism, particularly the Jushi school imported from Song dynasty China, provided the official philosophical foundation for Tokugawa rule. This systematic philosophical tradition emphasized moral cultivation, proper social relationships, and cosmic principles underlying both natural phenomena and human society. The shogunate established the Shoheiko in Edo as an official academy, teaching Neo-Confucian texts to samurai officials. Domain schools throughout Japan similarly based their curricula on Neo-Confucian classics that justified hierarchical relationships and emphasized the ethical obligations of rulers to govern with benevolence, while subjects responded with loyalty and obedience. Within this broad Confucian framework, significant philosophical variations developed. The Kogaku, or ancient learning school, advocated returning to the original texts of Confucius and Mencius, rather than relying on later commentaries. Scholars like Yamaga Soko and Ogyu Sarai questioned aspects of orthodox Neo-Confucianism, reinterpreting classical sources to address contemporary Japanese conditions. Sarai particularly emphasized the historical foundations of social institutions, rather than their basis in timeless cosmic principles, subtly undermining the ahistorical claims of Tokugawa legitimacy. These intellectual explorations remained within broadly Confucian parameters, but introduced important critical perspectives on received authority. The Shingaku, or heart learning movement, founded by Ishida Baigen, represented another significant variation, blending Confucian ethics with Buddhist and Shinto elements. to create practical moral teachings accessible to merchants and artisans. Addressing the contradiction between the low official status of merchants and their growing economic importance, Shingaku teachings legitimized commercial activity as socially beneficial when conducted ethically. Through accessible lectures and moralistic tales, Shingaku teachers spread values of honesty, diligence, and social responsibility among urban commoners, creating ethical frameworks adapted to commercial society rather than warrior values. Traditional Buddhism faced intellectual challenges during the Tokugawa period, despite its institutional entrenchment. Buddhist thought had flourished during earlier centuries, with innovative Japanese developments of Tendai, Shingon, Pure Land, and Zen traditions. However, under Tokugawa rule, Buddhism became increasingly integrated into state administrative functions through the temple registration system. This official role, combined with comfortable economic arrangements through death ritual monopolies, contributed to intellectual stagnation in mainstream Buddhist institutions. The most vibrant Buddhist thinking often emerged from reform movements criticizing established temple hierarchies and seeking return to foundational spiritual practices. A significant intellectual movement known as Kokugaku, or national learning, emerged in reaction against the dominance of Chinese Confucian thought in official discourse. Scholars, including Motoori Norinaga and Kamo Mabuchi, sought to recover a pure Japanese tradition by studying ancient texts like the Kojiki and Manyoshu, developing sophisticated philological methods to extract indigenous concepts from texts influenced by Chinese literary forms. These scholars celebrated distinctively Japanese aesthetic and spiritual sensibilities found in ancient literature, contrasting them favorably with what they characterized as the excessively rationalistic and moralistic Chinese tradition. Kokugaku scholarship evolved from purely literary and linguistic studies into increasingly political directions by the late Tokugawa period. Hirata Atsutane expanded the movement's focus to include revival of ancient Shinto practices and cosmological views centered on the divine origins of the imperial line. His writings emphasized Japan's spiritual superiority to other nations and the sacred nature of the Japanese polity. While initially focused on scholarly recovery of ancient traditions, Kokugaku thinking ultimately contributed to emerging nationalism that questioned the legitimacy of the shogunate while elevating imperial authority, a perspective that would play a crucial role in feudalism's eventual overthrow. Western knowledge filtered into Japan through the narrow channel of Rangaku, or Dutch learning, permitted under the otherwise strict isolation policies. Initially focused on practical medical knowledge, Rangaku scholars gradually expanded their interests to encompass astronomy, geography, botany, physics, and military science. Translations of Dutch texts introduced Copernican astronomy, Newtonian physics, Linnean biological classification, and modern anatomical understanding to Japanese intellectual circles. These scientific concepts challenged traditional East Asian cosmological views and demonstrated Western technological advancement that could not be easily dismissed. The most significant work translating Western scientific knowledge was Sugita Genpaku's Kaitai Shinsho, an anatomy text based on a Dutch translation of a German work. Sugita and his colleagues performed dissections, confirming the accuracy of Western anatomical illustrations, an experience he described as like walking in darkness when suddenly a light appears. This empirical verification of Western scientific accuracy stimulated interest in other areas of European knowledge and gradually undermined confidence in traditional explanations of natural phenomena. The concept that objective investigation could yield reliable knowledge independent of established authority represented a subtle but profound challenge to feudal thought patterns. Beyond specific scientific content, Rangaku introduced methodological approaches, emphasizing empirical observation, mathematical analysis, and systematic classification. Japanese scholars engaging with Western science began applying these methods to indigenous subjects, including detailed surveys of Japanese geography, flora, fauna, and mineral resources. This empirical tradition found expression in scholars like Ino Tadataka, who conducted Japan's first accurate coastal surveys using modern astronomical techniques, and Takahashi Yoshitoki, who calculated solar and lunar orbits with precision surpassing traditional calendar methods. These practical demonstrations of scientific efficacy gradually shifted intellectual authority from classical texts toward empirical investigation. Historical scholarship underwent significant development during the Tokugawa period, with implications for understanding Japan's political structures. The Mitogaku, or Mito school, sponsored by the daimyo of Mito domain, undertook the massive project of compiling the Dainihon Shi, a comprehensive history of Japan. While officially loyal to the Tokugawa regime, Mito scholars emphasized the imperial line's unbroken descent and historical significance, subtly questioning the shogunate's relationship to this ultimate source of legitimacy. This historical perspective, combined with growing awareness of Western imperial threats, contributed to the Sono Joi, or revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, ideology that would animate anti-Tokugawa movements in the Bakumatsu period. Practical learning traditions developed alongside more theoretical scholarship, addressing governance, agriculture, commerce, and social welfare. Agronomist scholars like Miyazaki Yasusada compiled detailed manuals on farming techniques, crop varieties, and land management. Economic thinkers such as Kumazawa Banzan, Honda Toshiaki, and Sato Nobuhiro developed increasingly sophisticated analyses of production, trade, and monetary policy. These practical intellectual traditions often combined Confucian ethical concerns with empirical observation and pragmatic problem-solving approaches, creating a distinctive Japanese policy discourse that would influence later modernization efforts. By the early 19th century, awareness of Western imperial expansion in Asia stimulated new forms of strategic thinking. The fall of China's Qing dynasty to British power in the Opium War, 1839 to 1842, particularly alarmed Japanese observers. Scholars like Sakuma Shozan and Yokoi Shonan argued for selective adoption of Western military technology and organizational methods, while maintaining Japanese cultural and spiritual foundations. The slogan, Eastern Ethics, Western Science, captured this synthetic approach, which sought to strengthen Japan against external threats while preserving core values. This strategic thinking represented an important intellectual bridge between feudal traditions and modernizing imperatives. These diverse intellectual currents flowed together in complex ways during the final decades of the Tokugawa period. Neo-Confucian orthodoxy remained officially dominant, but faced challenges from multiple directions. Kokugaku nativism questioned the legitimacy of Chinese cultural models. Rangaku scholarship demonstrated the practical superiority of Western scientific approaches. Historical studies raised questions about the shogunate's relationship to imperial authority, and economic writings highlighted the contradictions between feudal status hierarchies and commercial realities. Together, these intellectual developments created conceptual resources for reimagining Japanese society beyond feudal parameters. The intellectual ferment of the late Tokugawa period directly influenced the leaders who would eventually dismantle feudalism during the Meiji Restoration. Many key figures in the anti-Tokugawa movement emerged from these scholarly traditions, particularly from lower-ranking samurai families with strong educational backgrounds, but limited opportunities within the ossified feudal structure. Their exposure to diverse intellectual perspectives, from Neo-Confucian ideals of virtuous governance to Kokugaku celebration of imperial legitimacy to Rangaku awareness of Western power, shaped their understanding of Japan's challenges and possibilities. The feudal system that had nurtured this intellectual flowering would ultimately be transformed by the very ideas it had allowed to develop. As the 19th century progressed, the Tokugawa system faced mounting pressures, both internal and external, that would ultimately bring Japan's feudal era to a dramatic close. Economic strains, social tensions, ideological challenges, and foreign threats converged to undermine a political structure that had maintained stability for over 2 centuries. The final decades of Tokugawa rule witnessed increasing signs of systemic crisis, desperate reform attempts, and ultimately the collapse of feudal institutions. Yet even as the formal structures of samurai rule disappeared, core elements of samurai culture and values would continue to shape Japanese national identity into the modern era and beyond. The Tokugawa shogunate's financial difficulties intensified during its final decades. Despite repeated currency debasement, forced loans from wealthy merchants, and attempts to increase agricultural productivity, both the central bakufu and most domain governments faced chronic budget deficits. The economic foundation of samurai rule, control of agricultural surplus through rice taxation, proved increasingly inadequate as commercial activity generated wealth that feudal institutions struggled to tap effectively. Lower-ranking samurai particularly suffered from fixed stipends that failed to keep pace with inflation, creating a discontented class of educated warriors with diminishing stakes in maintaining the system. Natural disasters compounded these economic challenges. The Tempo famine of 1833 to 1837, triggered by unusually cold weather that destroyed rice harvests across Japan, caused widespread suffering and numerous peasant uprisings. The Great Ansei earthquake of 1855 devastated Edo, destroying samurai residences and government buildings, while being interpreted by many as an ominous sign for the regime. These catastrophes strained relief resources, highlighted administrative inadequacies, and intensified questioning of the Tokugawa order's ability to fulfill its basic protective functions. Reform efforts by the shogunate proved insufficient to address these systemic problems. The Tempo reforms implemented by senior councillor Mizuno Tadakuni between 1841 and 1843 attempted to revitalize Tokugawa rule through currency stabilization, sumptuary regulations restricting merchant luxury, forced price reductions, and bureaucratic restructuring. Despite initial vigor, these measures faced resistance from entrenched interests and failed to address underlying structural contradictions. The reforms' limited success demonstrated the difficulty of preserving feudal institutions against powerful economic and social currents moving in contrary directions. Western imperial pressure delivered the decisive external shock to this already strained system. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay with 4 black ships, steam-powered warships whose technology demonstrated Western military superiority. Perry delivered a letter from President Fillmore, demanding diplomatic relations and protection for shipwrecked American sailors. When Perry returned the following year with a larger fleet, the shogunate, recognizing its military vulnerability, signed the Convention of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports to American ships and establishing a U.S. consulate. Similar unequal treaties with other Western powers soon followed. These treaty concessions triggered a profound political crisis. The shogunate had violated fundamental national seclusion policies without imperial approval, undercutting its legitimacy as protector of the realm. The emperor's formal consent was hastily sought but internally disputed. The slogan Sono Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, gained popularity, especially among lower-ranking samurai in domains traditionally distant from Tokugawa control. Anti-foreign incidents multiplied, including attacks on Western diplomats and merchants that provoked punitive military responses, demonstrating feudal Japan's strategic vulnerability. Political divisions widened as various factions proposed conflicting responses to the Western challenge. Reformist officials like Hotta Masayoshi and Inaosuke recognized the need for military modernization and diplomatic engagement, while conservatives advocated expelling foreigners and returning to strict isolation. The shogunate attempted to build consensus by consulting daimyo lords, breaking with centuries of top-down governance. But this unprecedented move further revealed its weakening authority. When Chief Minister Heian Naosuke imposed his policy through the Ansei purge of opponents, his assassination in 1860 by anti-foreign samurai demonstrated the regime's inability to contain growing political violence. Several domains, particularly Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen, emerged as centers of opposition to Tokugawa hegemony. Initially divided between pro-imperial and pro-foreign factions, these domains gradually developed a unified perspective, advocating both imperial restoration and selective westernization to strengthen Japan against colonial threats. Lower-ranking samurai, with formal education but limited opportunities within the ossified Tokugawa hierarchy, often led these reform movements. The humbling of Satsuma by British naval forces in 1863 and the bombardment of Choshu coastal defenses in 1864 convinced many domain leaders that expelling foreigners was impossible without first modernizing Japan's military and political systems. The shogunate's final modernization efforts proved too little, too late. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, implemented military reforms, purchasing Western weapons and hiring French advisors to train Bakufu forces. Diplomatic missions to Europe and America acquired knowledge of Western political systems, industrial methods, and military organization. Progressive officials like Katsu Kaishu advocated fundamental restructuring of government along Western lines. However, these belated initiatives could not overcome the accumulated loss of political legitimacy and the momentum shifting toward imperial restoration as the focus for national renewal. In November 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu formally resigned as shogun, hoping to maintain a significant political role within a new imperial government. However, radical elements from Satsuma and Choshu seized the imperial palace in Kyoto on January 3, 1868, and proclaimed the restoration of direct imperial rule. When Yoshinobu mobilized troops to regain control, the brief Boshin War erupted. Despite superior numbers, Bakufu forces lost the decisive Battle of Toba-Fushimi, with many Tokugawa allies defecting or remaining neutral. Further resistance in Edo was avoided through negotiations by Katsu Kaishu, though fighting continued in northern Japan until mid-1869. The surrender of the last Tokugawa holdouts at Hakodate marked the definitive end of feudal military government in Japan. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, named for the era name of the young emperor Mutsuhito, represented both culmination and transformation of samurai-led political change. The Restoration government initially included representatives from court nobility and various domains, but power increasingly concentrated among leaders from the four key anti-Tokugawa domains, particularly Satsuma and Choshu. These samurai reformers, including figures like Saigo Takamori, Kido Takayoshi, Ito Hirobumi, and Yamagata Aritomo, recognized that preserving Japanese independence required fundamental restructuring of political, military, and economic systems along Western lines. The dismantling of feudal institutions proceeded with remarkable speed. In 1869, the daimyo formally returned their domains to imperial authority, receiving appointments as governors of their former territories. By 1871, these domains were abolished entirely and replaced with prefectures administered by the central government. The elaborate status hierarchy of Tokugawa society was officially abandoned in 1871, with former samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants unified as imperial subjects with formal legal equality. The commoner classes generally welcomed these changes, while the former elite experienced them as profound disruption of traditional identities and privileges. For the samurai class specifically, the Meiji Restoration brought dramatic transformation rather than simple abolition. The privilege of wearing swords, the visible symbol of samurai status, was eliminated in 1876, striking at warrior identity. Military reforms replaced domain armies with a national conscript force based on European models, ending the samurai monopoly on martial service. Most significantly, the government converted hereditary samurai stipends first to interest-bearing bonds and then to one-time cash payments, fundamentally altering the economic basis of samurai existence from hereditary entitlement to capital investment. These rapid changes provoked the last armed resistance from conservative samurai elements. The Saga Rebellion of 1874, led by former Restoration leader Eto Shinpei, briefly challenged the central government but was quickly suppressed. More significantly, the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by the renowned samurai Saigo Takamori, represented the last major armed uprising of traditional warriors against modernizing reforms. After initial successes, Saigo's forces were defeated by the modern imperial army, with Saigo himself committing suicide rather than surrendering. This decisive defeat demonstrated that the age of the samurai as a military class had truly ended. Despite the abolition of formal samurai status, former warrior families pursued various adaptation strategies in the New Japan. Many invested their stipend bonds in business ventures with mixed success. Others entered government service as bureaucrats, diplomats, police officers, and teachers, where their education and administrative experience proved valuable. Some became officers in the new imperial military forces, transferring martial values to modern institutional contexts. A smaller number embraced entrepreneurship, using their connections and education to establish successful enterprises. Through these diverse paths, former samurai played crucial roles in Japan's rapid modernization while experiencing profound disruption of traditional identities. The Meiji government consciously preserved and repurposed elements of samurai values, even while dismantling feudal institutions. Bushido was reinterpreted as a national ethic rather than a class-specific code, with virtues like loyalty, self-discipline, and self-sacrifice promoted as distinctively Japanese qualities expected of all imperial subjects. The 1890 Imperial Rescript on Education institutionalized these values in the national school system, emphasizing loyalty to the emperor, filial piety, and willingness to sacrifice for the nation. Military training incorporated modified samurai moral concepts alongside Western technical methods. This selective adaptation of samurai ethics to modern nationalist purposes created ideological continuity amid institutional transformation. Japanese cultural production during the Meiji period reflected complex attitudes toward the samurai past. Early Meiji literature often critiqued feudal values and celebrated new social possibilities. However, as Japan secured its independence and achieved international recognition, cultural nostalgia for samurai traditions increased. Historical novels romanticized warrior virtues, theater productions celebrated famous samurai exploits, and popular publications promoted Bushido as Japan's unique ethical heritage. This cultural ambivalence toward the feudal past, simultaneously rejecting its institutions while selectively celebrating its values, characterized Japan's complex relationship with its samurai heritage. The international reception of samurai imagery followed a similar pattern of romanticization, detached from historical complexities. Western observers like Lafcadio Hearn popularized idealized portraits of samurai as noble warrior philosophers embodying exotic Eastern wisdom and martial prowess. The 1900 publication of Nitobe Inazo's Bushido, the Soul of Japan, in English, presented samurai ethics as Japan's equivalent to Western chivalry, emphasizing aesthetic and spiritual dimensions while downplaying problematic historical realities. These selective international interpretations reinforced Japan's own cultural re-evaluation of its samurai heritage. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, the samurai legacy has maintained powerful cultural resonance while undergoing continuous reinterpretation. During Japan's imperial expansion, militarists emphasized the martial aspects of Bushido to inspire sacrifice in modern warfare. After World War II, more humanistic interpretations stressed the cultural and spiritual dimensions of samurai tradition. Contemporary Japanese engagement with this heritage ranges from serious scholarly examination of historical realities to creative reimagining in manga, anime, and video games that reach global audiences. Tourism, martial arts, and cultural performances continue to invoke samurai imagery as emblematic of Japanese cultural distinctiveness. The actual historical samurai were neither the perfect warrior philosophers of romantic legend, nor merely brutal enforcers of feudal hierarchy. They were complex historical actors who created and maintained a distinctive social order that evolved over centuries to meet changing conditions. Their cultural accomplishments, ethical ideals, aesthetic sensibilities, and governing institutions represented remarkable achievements that influenced Japanese civilization far beyond their formal abolition. The tensions within samurai identity, between violence and refinement, loyalty and ambition, tradition and innovation, reflected broader contradictions within human experience that give their story continuing resonance. The feudal Japan, created and governed by the samurai for nearly 7 centuries, represents one of history's most distinctive social and political experiments. Unlike European feudalism, which gradually evolved into absolutist monarchy and then constitutional government, Japanese feudalism reached its most developed form in the Tokugawa period, before rapid transformation through the Meiji Restoration. This compressed historical trajectory created the unique phenomenon of former samurai themselves dismantling feudal institutions and building modern alternatives, preserving cultural continuity amid institutional revolution. The result was a modernization process that maintained distinctive Japanese characteristics while adopting Western technologies and organizational methods. As the physical reality of samurai rule recedes into history, its cultural echoes continue reverberating through Japanese society and global imagination. the aesthetic sensibilities developed through centuries of samurai patronage remain visible in contemporary Japanese design, architecture, and artisanal traditions. Ethical concepts derived from Bushido influence modern Japanese corporate culture, educational philosophy, and interpersonal etiquette. Martial arts originated by samurai for battlefield application have evolved into global practices emphasizing personal development and philosophical insight. These persistent influences demonstrate how thoroughly samurai culture permeated Japanese civilization during its centuries of development. The story of the samurai and feudal Japan offers profound insights into how societies organize power, cultivate values, and navigate between tradition and change. From the emergence of mounted warriors in ancient Japan through the refined court culture of the Heian period, from the chaotic warfare of the Sengoku era to the elaborate political structures of the 18th century Tokugawa peace, and finally, through the dramatic transformation of the Meiji Restoration, this historical journey reveals both the remarkable achievements and inherent limitations of feudal social organization. The samurai legacy remains alive not merely as historical memory, but as a continuing cultural resource that Japan and the world continue to explore, critique, and reinterpret in light of evolving contemporary concerns. The final sleep of feudal Japan came not through violent revolution, but through transformation, led by members of the very class that had defined the feudal order. In this peaceful passing into history lies perhaps the most distinctive feature of Japan's feudal experience. The samurai, as a formal status group, disappeared into the pages of history, but their cultural influence, ethical ideals, and aesthetic sensibilities continue shaping Japanese identity. The sword has been laid to rest, but the spirit that forged it remains active in countless subtle ways, connecting contemporary Japan to its distinctive historical journey. Through centuries of samurai rule and the remarkable civilization they created,